Monster Hunter Rise is 4 years old. It was initially released for the Nintendo Switch in March of 2021, and was designed to be the ultimate portable Monster Hunter, a game that you could pick up and play whenever, wherever. It was the very next game to come after Monster Hunter World, a significant breakout hit in the series, and this meant Rise carried forward a lot of its changes and improvements, but it also meant that there were big expectations for the game. Seeing as it's been 4 years, and Monster Hunter Wilds has just come out, I think it's the perfect time to really take a good look at Rise. It's been content complete for years, and the game is quite significant to both me and this channel. So today, we'll be taking a look back at Monster Hunter Rise, the new aspects the game brought to the table, the things it did well, the things it did poorly, and why the game was rather divisive. This video will largely be focused on Rise and not the Sunbreak expansion, which I believe deserves its own video sometime into the future. And despite the game being exclusive to the Nintendo Switch for a significant chunk of its life, most footage here will be from the PC version as it's cleaner, smoother, and overall nicer to watch. This video was written and recorded before the release of Monster Hunter Wilds. As such, the game will not be spoiled, nor will it really be discussed. Let's talk about Rise's central mechanic, the biggest thing it brought to the table. The Wirebugs are essentially grappling hooks that you can use to swing off anything. You have 2 of them at all times, and they have fairly short cooldowns depending on the action, which means you can cover large distances before having to hit the ground. What makes them even better is that you have the ability to briefly hang in the air, which can allow you to cancel your momentum and or readjust the direction you're headed in. The Wirebug controls are also rather simple to use, and what's cool is that you can freely practice in the game's hub, Kamura Village. To reach the top of the main building, you do actually have to learn how to conserve Wirebugs. In my Clutch Claw video, I pointed out that a good chunk of the problems with that tool come from it being added to a game that was not designed around it. The advantage of Rise being designed around the Wirebug is that it's baked into the game in a huge amount of places, and this naturally includes the locales themselves. Back in the day, Monster Hunter locales would let you climb up very specific short ledges or cliffs that had vines hanging down. Rise, however, lets you climb anything. See a cliff? You don't have to look for vines, you can just start running up it very easily. It costs a lot of stamina, but by leaping off and hanging with a Wirebug, you can wait for it to recharge before continuing the climb. Smart use of the Wirebugs will let you get up pretty much anything, and the locales are designed around your extreme movement capabilities. You can still find vines here and there. The advantage to climbing them this time is that you don't fall off when your stamina runs out. There's also these great Wirebug spots scattered around each locale. By obtaining them through side quests, you can place them down at predetermined spots and soar massive distances, which can really help with getting around. In addition to this, there's extra Wirebugs scattered around that temporarily allow you to add a third addition to your arsenal. It doesn't last that long, but it can be a massive help for both traversal and combat. With the ability to climb anything and swing through the air with Iron Silk, it almost makes Rise's traversal feel like a cross between Breath of the Wild and Marvel's Spider-Man. Easily the most fun it's ever been. What's cool is that if you don't want to bother with Wirebugs when moving around, you don't really have to. There's plenty of other options for getting around. You can ride the Palamutes, which are new companions introduced to Rise. They're fairly speedy, can jump a decent height, climb up vines, fight alongside you, and you can bring them on multiplayer quests. Every combat zone in a locale is always accessible without the bugs too. If the Wirebug movement is something you're not really a fan of, riding the Palamutes around is a simple matter. And smart use of the Wirebugs and Great Wirebugs can often allow those who brought a Palico to easily keep up with everyone else. Wirebugs don't just allow you to traverse through the locales, they also play a massive role in Rise's combat. When your weapon is sheathed, you naturally have free access to the normal Wirebug movements, allowing you to zip out of the way of monster attacks in ways you previously couldn't. They sort of act as a jump button, meaning you can perform an aerial attack whenever you want. To do that in the older Monster Hunter games, you would either need a ledge or an insect glaive, but in Rise it's just on demand. The result of this is that Rise's combat zones are generally rather flat, with pretty much no variation in terrain. This is a departure from the Monster Hunter 4 or World locale designs, where the combat zones felt like real natural formations. Even Generations, while very flat, had the occasional ledge scattered around on older returning locales for you to jump off. But with Rise, a ledge would serve very little purpose, as you can go into the air whenever you want. In the Monster Hunter Rise artbook, director Ichinose said this decision was made so that combat could be based more on the player's skill and monster interactions. It is also worth mentioning that Monster Hunter 4 and World's combat zones were often criticised for being too busy, so perhaps this change was a good thing. So how is Rise's combat anyway? Removing Wirebugs from the equation, it's almost identical to World's. Many attacks and mechanics were carried over. Longsword still has its counters, Greatsword still has the true charge slash, all weapons can dodge backwards, etc. However, there are some nice changes. Dual Swords in the older games would have demon mode cancelled if a monster were to interrupt you with a roar. Not so in World, where I found myself constantly running out of stamina as demon mode continues, but Rise made it more like the older games in this regard. Hammer had the special charge mode in World, but Rise turned it into more of an alternate stance thing. On the other hand, Charge Blade SAEDs were altered and are now much worse, and Savage Axe isn't great in this game either compared to Iceborne. The Hunting Horn was also completely overhauled with a very simplified moveset in a failed attempt to make the weapon more popular. So there's good and bad changes, but that's natural with Monster Hunter games. But when you factor in the Wirebugs, things become more interesting. Pressing ZL and the attack buttons allows you to perform Silkbind attacks, which use the Wirebugs and have a cooldown period as they recharge. Some use a single bug, while others use two, and they can have different purposes. Take the Dual Swords. Piercing Bind places a kunai knife into the monster, which doubles your attacks for a while before it explodes. Another allows you to counter-evade through attacks, while the third sends you into the air while the swords are unsheathed, which isn't normally possible. Some Silk Binds can be incredibly devastating attacks, while others are designed to parry a monster strike. Some are simply used to move you around, and some can even provide a temporary buff. They end up giving you more options in combat and allow you to do some really stylish maneuvers. It's worth mentioning many of the Silk Binds are adapted from some of World Iceborne's specific attacks, as well as Generation's hunting styles and arts. You can use these attacks somewhat frequently in combat, but the Wirebug cooldowns ensure that they're not exactly spammable, especially because some of them use two bugs. When those attacks are used, the bugs have to recharge one after the other, rather than simultaneously. One of the more interesting aspects of Rise's combat is that you can unlock more basic attacks for weapons and swap them with the normal ones, which are known as switch skills. Greatsword, for example, can swap the true charge slash with a stationary charge that has super armor. Hammer's alternate charge can be exchanged with Courage mode, which effectively lets the weapon play how Valor Hammer did in Generations. Gunlance can swap its charge cells with Blast Dash from Generations. This is genuinely a really cool feature. You can gain different attacks that really change up a weapon's playstyle. Bow can swap its normal charge step for Dodge Bolt, which is a shorter evade but has a hunter swing and arrow. This is a parry, and dodging with the right timing will raise your charge level, which means bow users can fight close range to a greater degree than before. Dual Swords can exchange its draw attack for an alternate one that not only has invincibility frames but sends you up into the air. Combined with the Tower Vault Silkbind from earlier, it allows for an aerial style of play. Silkbind switch skills can also be unlocked. For example, the Longsword can exchange the Helmbreaker for the Sakura Slash from Generations, which increases the spirit gauge level, allowing you to play Longsword more traditionally. But on the other hand, some switch skills are just indisputably better than the base attack and become almost like replacements. Longsword's overhead slash can be replaced with a new drawn double slash that can resist attacks and let you skip the first stage of a spirit combo. It's just a lot better, and there's not really any reason for you to use the original attack. This also applies to the Insect Glave's Recalk Insect Silkbind, which sort of acts like a dodge. Later on, you can replace it with the Diving Wyvern attack, which was from Iceborne, and you have little reason to ever go back. The Charged Blade retains the sword charge mode from Iceborne, but now it has to be swapped out in order to gain access to Iceborne's Savage Axe mode. In that game you could have both, but in Rise you have to choose. In many ways it's a step backwards. Overall, Silkbinds are fairly simple to execute, can't be spammed, and add a lot to the game's combat, while switch skills allow for some really awesome alternate playstyles. The combat is pretty good, but that's only half of the equation here. Good combat is nothing without good monsters. Rise, after its updates, has a great roster, a wonderful selection of easy, medium, hard and harder bosses, with a great variety in terms of fighting styles and body types, especially with the newcomers. Great Izuchi is one of the better tutorial monsters in the series. He has some wonderfully telegraphed attacks, and I love the sounds he makes. His central mechanic is that he coordinates attacks with his minions. Sometimes he'll lead and they'll follow up, and sometimes he'll let them go first and perform the finisher himself. However, this mechanic sadly doesn't really affect the fight a whole lot. The minions get caught in the crossfire of your own attacks and tend to die before doing too much. They do respawn, but even as a low rank hunter I hardly notice them. It's good that Great Izuchi has a solid moveset, because otherwise he would be a bit of a dud. I really like Aknosom. He has an amazing design, looking like a crane with a giant parasol-like crest. He likes to smack it down with a surprising impact, and he's so acrobatic in the air. Tetranodon is also fantastic, partly because of his design, being a giant green platypus covered in moss, but also he's just a lot of fun to fight. Tetranodon's whole deal is that he'll eat halfway through the fight and increase his size, which changes up his fighting style quite a bit. He can also do this by pinning you, which is a lot of fun. He really fishes for it too. Bishaten is good. I personally don't really vibe with him, but once again he's got a good design, and a unique moveset partially focused on acrobatics, but also throwing fruit, which he can be awfully precise with. The fruit can be picked up and thrown back at him, which is fun. Somnocanth is another monster that I think is good on paper, but again I don't really vibe with. She's a leviathan that likes to partially submerge herself in water, but I find her attacks a bit annoying to read, and I don't find sleep to be an interesting status element to deal with. Armadron is highly controversial among Rise players. He's another leviathan that's just massive. He swims around in mud and can launch at you with a giant brush-like tail. People don't like Armadron because his size can make his attacks hard to see coming, and he's rather unconventional when it comes to monster movesets. I personally think he's really cool for that reason, because it feels like I have to be more careful than normal when fighting him. His gear is actually really cool too. Gosharag is among the top 10 best new 5th gen monsters. He's basically a yeti that uses icy breath to create blades of ice on his arms. So he starts the fight by using his fists, before eventually bringing out the swords and changing his whole fighting style. The swords are vulnerable and when broken, cause him to collapse, but he's also so much more dangerous when they're out. And if you get stunned by him, he's hard coded to do a slow walk of death towards you. It's one of the craziest things I've ever seen from this game. What's cool about Gosharag is that he's basically a giant, much harder Azoras, and seeing as he's one of the first monsters you fight, it makes for an interesting bookend. Ragnakudaki is a Temnosaurun, a giant spider who cannot be killed with fire, because it's her whole deal. Her head can unlatch from her body, and she has these creepy minions that she can work with during combat. Unlike the Great Izuchi, they're far more disposable to her. She can use them for mobility by throwing them, and using a web to pull herself in different directions, command them to attack, and more. You can break the webbing on her legs and back, which causes her to collapse, and then temporarily coats her back in hardened webbing to slowly restore herself. I like this part of the fight a bit less, but it does change up her fighting style. Then we have Magnamalo, the flagship of the game. I love Magnamalo. There's so many aspects to his fight that shouldn't really work together, but they do. And it makes every battle with him a wild experience because of all the tricks he has up his sleeve. He can use his arms and tail and head in so many different ways that still sometimes catch me by surprise despite 100 or so fights against him. I love his music too. I made an hour-long video about Rise's final boss duo, Wind Serpent Ibushi and Thunder Serpent Narwa. Despite some execution problems in Rise's base game, I really like them. You should check the video out to hear my full thoughts, but essentially, they're really well designed fights that seem tricky at first, but really reward you for knowing their attacks, as they constantly leave different weak points open. I love their music and role in the story too. There's two types of returning monsters in Rise, the monsters who are in World and those who were brought back from the older games. The second group consists of monsters such as the Great Baggy, Arzuras, Basarios, Mizutsune, and these are mostly good. The fights are one thing, but I'm quite impressed by how detailed some of them look visually, especially on the Switch. Arzuras has well-defined fur that bounces around as he runs and attacks. Mizutsune's fins are fully animated. Royal Ludroth has an incredibly detailed sponge too. Keep in mind that many of these monsters couldn't be fought on the Nintendo Switch in Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate. That game was built for the 3DS, but regardless, you can really feel the generational leap here. Then we have the monsters from World and Iceborne, and by that I mean those who originated from that game, as well as those who are from previous games and were remade for this one before being ported to Rise. There's a lot of these monsters, Anjanath, Puke, but also Nargacuga, Tigrex, Barioth, and many more. What's cool about these guys is that in Rise, they visually don't look so different compared to how they are in World and Iceborne. Obviously there's a reduction in detail that's more obvious on the very polygonal monsters like Rathian or Rathalos, but other monsters like Tigrex, Rajang or Nargacuga honestly look identical when you're not comparing them. But what about the hunting? Well, many of these monsters were either remade from the older games, or ported from the very difficult Iceborne expansion. The latter group of monsters were adjusted accordingly for the low and high rank Rise, so they're either missing attacks, perform them slower, or are completely overhauled. For example, Nargacuga was overhauled. In Iceborne, he fought very differently compared to the other games, but in Rise, he's borderline identical to his generation's ultimate G-rank self. Iceborne players will tell you what a menace Barioth was, but in Rise he's rather manageable and doesn't really move around as much. Some monsters like Rajang are completely neutered and feel much less threatening than they did even in the older games. However, in other cases, some monsters can be trickier than they were in World. Tobi-Kadachi is a prime example since, inverse to Rajang and Barioth, he was actually given attacks from his Iceborne subspecies Viper Tobi-Kadachi, and shocked people who thought he would be as simple as he was in World. Rathalos saw substantial movement differences that make him much more fun and dangerous to deal with, as he doesn't stay in the air as much, but is also no slouch on the ground either. Gyrotodus oddly was buffed up to have a natural roar and be less pathetic, and Kushala Deora is also fun for the first time while still being very dangerous. And of course, for better or worse, some monsters like Rathian or Diablos feel the same as they did in World. The older returning monsters tend to be substantially changed. While they fight the same way they did in the older games, they're sometimes sped up, and chain attacks more often, and of course are given new ones. Great Baggy, for example, has a couple of Anjanath attacks, Azores can do this funky tackle, and Mizutsune is capable of more sliding shenanigans. Basarios heats up with every fire attack, which causes his body to soften and glow, taking more damage with every attack. It makes him easier, but less frustrating than the older games. On that note, it's worth mentioning that Rise quickly gained a reputation for being too easy, not offering up enough challenge, and in general just being the easiest game in the series. This is nothing new, all Monster Hunters get accused of this even as far back as 2009, but why Rise in particular this time? It's simple, a lot of the monsters are simply not built for this kind of combat. At the very least, they struggle to deal with the hunters and their silkbinds. Most of the Rise originals and late game monsters tend to be fine, but everyone else, When you think about World's combat or most Monster Hunters, to get around monster attacks you have to dodge or make use of a special weapon mechanic, like blocking with a shield or parrying. There's either risks to doing these things like potentially still getting hit, or accidentally blocking an unblockable attack, or there's costs involved. Blocking and dodging cost stamina, and require armor skills to really enhance. Messing up a longsword counter or a lance block can really set you back a bit. Silkbind attacks can be quick to execute, often move you very far very fast, and don't really cost a whole lot, only a Wirebug or two which will recharge soon enough. Take the Charge Blade's counter peak performance. You stand in place and for a single Wirebug can block an attack and instantly fill all your files. This normally would take much more work, and the Wirebug cooldown isn't even high. Or the Hammer's Impact Crater. It needs a fairly big window to execute, but it does so much damage and only costs 2 bugs. Then there's the Wirefall, a technique that lets you leap away with a Wirebug after getting hit by a monster. It costs a single Wirebug with a fairly long cooldown, and does leave you vulnerable, so there's a risk to using it if you try and launch yourself back into combat. However, if you just Wirefall away and heal, the monster can't really do anything to you. You're safe, you're all good, which effectively turns the move into something of a crutch. Some monsters are designed to counter it, but only around 3. The long Wirebug cooldown sucks, but as long as you don't constantly use it, there should always be a Wirebug free. All weapons can Wirefall, which kinda makes matters worse. I think generally, HR6 and above monsters are fine to fight in Rise, and are in line with the difficulty of other games, but not so with the HR4 and 5 monsters. A lot of them had simple strategies that required patience or learning specific tells, and they all kind of fall apart here, like Rathian or Baroth, or I guess even Diablos even though he's HR7. Royal Ludroth for instance is absolutely pathetic in this game, but funnily enough it's not the case for some of the easier monsters. I think Azores is okay, especially at the level you're fighting him. Same with Roggy and Baggy, they're aggressive enough. And I do believe the Rise originals can deal with Wirebug wielding hunters just fine too, but it does mean a good portion of the game has you completely curb stomping a lot of the content in ways you probably shouldn't be allowed to get away with. Wyvern riding is a new mechanic in Rise that replaced mounting entirely, just for this game. After enough damage from Silkbind and aerial attacks have been inflicted on a monster, you get to wrangle them with Wirebugs and take control of their movements. From there, you can either ram them into walls and be done with it, which deals massive damage, or attack a different monster. Both options deal hefty damage to the monster you're riding or their opponents. Wyvern riding is fun, but it was way worse at launch than it is now, mostly because it broke the pace of combat completely. This was also the case with mounting, but that was a very deliberate act, since it could only be triggered through aerial attacks from ledges and other things. You usually only do those if you're looking for a mount. Wyvern riding on the other hand is triggered when enough Silkbind damage has been dealt, and that includes attacks that are grounded. Seeing as Wirebugs are a central mechanic in Rise, it's kind of unavoidable. What's more, is that at launch and for a good chunk of the game's life, it was activated either by you attacking the monster or pressing the A button when near them, which made not doing it quite hard. You'd have to stop attacking and wait 10 seconds or so. You wouldn't be able to pick up any items lying around either, since pressing the A button would send you onto the monster. Okay fine, let's get it over with and ram the monster into the wall. Except things don't really go back to normal because now the monster is tied in place with Wirebugs for a while. It's supposed to be a reward for Wyvern riding them successfully, but I would rather things just get back to normal. There's also an issue where some walls don't really count as walls, and if you try and ram the monster into them, they'll just slide off, which wastes a lot of damage. Iceborne had this too, and it was kind of annoying there as well. Another annoying Iceborne mechanic that would break the pace of combat was the Clagger, where monsters would stagger back and drool, aka the clutch claw me sign. I'm not sure if Wyvern riding was more or less annoying than those, because on average, it only happens once per hunt, while the Clagger would occur repeatedly. On the other hand, Wyvern riding broke the pace of combat for far longer regardless of whether or not you went through with it. Wyvern riding's main issues were ultimately fixed in Sunbreak because you can cancel the Wyvern ride animation by continuing to attack the monster, and because this update applied to the base game, that's now the case for Rise as well. There is another aspect to the whole thing that is controversial, in that monsters no longer invade to disrupt your hunts. Instead, they'll go for another monster and make them Wyvern rideable, either through a standard attack or a turf war. This means you never really need to prepare for the possibility of Bazalgoos or Rajang coming in to mess you up, because they'll actually help you this time. The monster vs monster battling itself is interesting. Non-targets in a locale take much less Silkbind damage to Wyvern ride, and there's an item called the Puppet Spider that lets you do it instantly. This means you can approach them before running into your target, ride them over, and get some nice sizable damage in before the fight really begins. There's a parry mechanic, and you generally get to use a huge variety of the monster's attacks. As you damage the opponent, you fill out a bar that when full lets you unleash a Mounted Punisher, which is a high damaging attack that knocks the monster over. What's kind of annoying is that you probably do the bulk of your damage before the Mounted Punisher is unlocked, and when that happens, you only have a limited time to execute it. There's an armor skill that lets you fill the gauge faster, and it's actually counterproductive for this reason. You want that to go on for as long as possible. Something fun about Wyvern riding though, is that mechanically you can do a lot. Attacks can be cancelled by dodging, which consumes a Wirebug, but it means you can effectively chain 3 attacks together, 4 if you grabbed another Wirebug. But they don't restore automatically like they do in combat unless you start sprinting. So depending on how fast the monster attacks, you can strike, dodge, sprint for a moment, and continue until the Mounted Punisher almost expires. There's a real science to it. Another aspect of Wyvern riding is that some monsters are just better than others. Their attacks are faster, or they deal with so much more damage and are more accurate. This is important because attacks can't be cancelled unless they make contact, and getting hits will reduce the amount of time you can ride, which can get dangerous if you're riding monsters like Tetranodon or Basarios, who are complete rubbish at this. You'd rather have Rajang or Magnamalo, whose fastest attacks can deal so much damage. Speaking of damage, portable Monster Hunter games generally give the monsters less health than their console counterparts, since you're not playing them for very long sessions, and if you are, well, more hunts for you. With and without Wyvern riding, I feel like Rise health pools are perfect. Wild hunts were often too short, Icebauns were too long. Rises have the perfect pacing for me. I just think it would have been better if a lot of them weren't as vulnerable to Silkbinds. Rise has 5 hunting locales. I touched upon this earlier, but they're entirely designed with the Wirebugs and new movement in mind, and traversing through them is actually really fun. The Shrine Ruins was the first one to be revealed for the game, and it's the first you encounter. The opening locale of a Monster Hunter game is always very significant. They give the hunter an initial impression of what the game will be like, and as such are usually designed to show off central mechanics. Tri has underwater combat, and its first locale is an island with 2 huge underwater zones with lots of room to mess around and get to grips with the movement. For Ultimate's Ancestral Step has many cliffs and varied terrain that lets you try out the hunter's enhanced climbing abilities, and what better way to show off World's focus on living, breathing, open zone worlds than with a giant forest. Rise has heavily expanded wall climbing, Wirebugs to swing around, and Palamute, but it's also trying to prove that it's on par with World in terms of gameplay. As such, the moment you move out of the Shrine Ruins first base camp, you're presented with a huge open field, as if the game is trying to say, see, we can do open maps too. Throughout the Nintendo Switch's lifespan, people have routinely underestimated its hardware capabilities. It's undeniably a bit of a potato. But long before Rise was announced, many doubted that a Monster Hunter game built for the system could even have open maps. Rise proved it could. The Shrine Ruins in some ways feels like a response to the Ancient Forest. While that locale was criticised for being a bit too complex and confusing, the Shrine Ruins is perhaps a little bit too simple. Layout wise, it can be boiled down into 2 pathways up a mountain, with several connecting paths in between. Adjacent to all these paths are mountains that can be freely climbed on. Rise locales are distinctly separated into combat zones and non-combat zones, and monsters can't go in most of those areas. So they're pretty much only for you, to practice wall running and Wirebug swinging. If you try and attack monsters from these points, they'll either aim for you or run away very far after not too long, so you can't really camp them out. The map has a really long river on the western side that flows all the way from the top and into the starting area. While the Shrine Ruins has hard borders and invisible walls on the map edges, you'll rarely find them within its bounds. You can truly climb onto everything. The random ruins scattered around, any of the several mountains, the base camp, the giant Palamute statues, The Breath of the Wild comparison really works. Rise's locales are truly open in a way previous Monster Hunters are not. The older games had these small segmented areas divided by loading zones, which were represented on the in-game maps by these lines. When World removed the loading zones, you'd still have these lines, but instead of a loading screen, it would be real space that you'd have to walk or slide across. Rise has these paths too, but they can be freely ignored as you beeline towards any area you want. And even if you do choose to make use of the more traditional paths, the Palamute helps you zoom through them. As far as starting maps go, I like the Shrine Ruins, it's simple but good. However, I do have a couple of criticisms. For one, I find the lighting to be quite dull. Rise locales have day-night cycles, which were introduced to the series with World, a game with very nice skies all around. But the Shrine Ruins is all grey during the daytime, and the nighttime skybox isn't very interesting either. It does look good when the sun is setting and during the early hours of the morning, and there's a period of time during twilight where the sky takes an almost greenish colour. I really like that, but it's only in these uncommon occurrences though. Another criticism involves the battle arena at the top of the mountain. It's sadly very underutilised as not many monsters tend to go there. Rojang is one of them, as well as Valstrax, anyone with wings really, but it's not very often. Instead, most of them go for the standard nest. It's a shame because it's actually a really cool place to end the fight on. The next locale is the Frost Islands. It was cool that Rise had an ice map from the very beginning, which was something World saved with DLC. The islands have some cool landmarks, such as a giant shipwreck, a huge Zora Magdaros skull, and a large set of caves. The Sandy Plains is a complete remake of a locale with the same name from Monster Hunter Tri, now with no loading zones. This makes for a really interesting opportunity to do direct comparisons and see what the positives and negatives are of these open zone locales. The original Sandy Plains felt huge because it seemed as though you were covering massive distances through each loading zone. In Rise, everything is within walking distance and feels awfully close together. You can see the desert from the very start of the map, which was not really possible in Tri. The scale of the locale is a lot smaller. Do you see that massive tree? Here it is in Rise, it's not as impressive, is it? Because there's no more loading zones, one of the old shortcuts from the original Sandy Plains is gone, because it wouldn't really make as much sense here. This massive hole is just for the monsters now. On top of all that, the vibes of the locale are completely different. The original Sandy Plains was a cross between a savanna and a desert, while the Rise Sandy Plains feels more like it's just a desert. Even the music reflects this. The Rise track is completely original and not a remix, and it sounds almost sort of Arabian inspired. To be positive though, I love the blue skies in this locale, and the loss of loading zones means you can get to areas in ways you never could in Tri. Here you can jump down all the way to the nest. In Tri, that would have taken a loading screen. The Flooded Forest is also a remake of a map from Tri, and this one is not only more faithful than the Sandy Plains, but also more interesting as a remake. Many of the original areas are still recognisable, but are also expanded in terms of how you can explore them. See that waterfall? You can now climb it. See this cave? Rise has an open roof that lets you wirebug in or out. That giant pyramid that was just a background detail in the original? Rise lets you scale and explore it. It's a really cool remake, even the music is very faithful too. That being said, the locale does have some real drawbacks. For one, it's ugly. The original was ugly in the way swamps normally are, but the Rise one looks so visually dull. I don't like it at all. It's also missing some of the better aspects of the original. For one, that beautiful nighttime skybox. Obviously Rise is a different form of lighting that's dynamic and always changing, but it's an obvious step down in terms of beauty. Not just that, the original Flooded Forest would rain sometimes. It was nothing major, but it added to the atmosphere. Rise does not have that effect at all. And it's not because of technical limitations or because rendering rain with modern graphics was too hard for the Switch, because it rains in a Sunbreak locale, and it looks great. The monsters even get wet, which didn't happen in Tri. It's just a sad omission for the Flooded Forest. Rise locales generally don't really have weather like that. That being said, I still appreciate not just the giant explorable pyramid, but all the little ones too. And they actually retained a major shortcut that was in the original game. It's accessed differently here, but still takes you from and to the exact same areas. And overall, the Rise Flooded Forest is still a mostly faithful remake of an underrated locale. Finally, we have the Lava Caverns, which as far as volcano locales go in Monster Hunter, is pretty damn unique, as it combines both hot and cool environments half and half. This allows for a huge variety of monsters, many of whom you would never expect to see in a volcano, like Kezu or Tetranodon. The cool caves have such nice lighting, and there's even a Narwa skeleton. While the lava caves feel very hot and are rather intricate, there's a lot of invisible walls in this locale due to all the lava, and once again it doesn't really have an interesting sky, but it's still good, and the music is actually very upbeat and grand, compared to how Monster Hunter volcanoes have usually been in the past. Rise locales have different incentives for exploration. There's endemic life everywhere that can be picked up as items to use for various buffs. Healing field, luring the monster, enhancing your items, and it does pay off to memorize their locations. There's spirit birds which buff your health, stamina, attack or defense by a very small amount, but they're everywhere, so it adds up. There's also a secret location in each locale that can be quite tricky to get to. For the shrine ruins, it's the tallest point. For the lava caverns, it's within the volcano. It's not always clear how you're supposed to get to these places, and the methods can be quite elaborate too. All locales have at least 2 subcamps as well. This was a feature that World introduced, and it allows you to build camps around the locales in fixed points by completing side quests. You can eat, change your equipment, and restock your items here. They're in good spots, and it takes very little time to teleport to them. Each locale has 12 or so relic records. These are hidden messages that give little bits of lore about the areas, and they have to be found through exploration. The messages can be very interesting. For example, the Shrine Ruins records tell us the history of the region and who used to live there. The Sandy Plains message revealed that a certain elder dragon was responsible for all the ruins there. The Frost Islands records even tell you where the shipwreck came from. The stories are interesting to read and a nice reward for really exploring the locales, especially because some of them can be really tricky to find. While Rise's endemic life generally act as powered up items you can find lying around, there are also rare specimens that can sometimes be found in certain spots on the map. The Shrine Ruins has a 9-tailed fox that sits on the roof of the ruins on the tallest mountain. The Frost Island is home to a massive beast called the Monk Snail that resides beyond the borders of the locale. You can wave to him and he'll respond back. The locales are mechanically really impressive when it comes to traversal and exploration, and it's absolutely crazy that they function well on the Switch. The multiple subcamps are really appreciated, and the endemic life and spirit birds provide great incentives to explore during a hunt. The relic records are a really nice touch, and are something I hope to see implemented in future entries. However, the locales do suffer from problems. The remakes of the Sandy Plains and Flooded Forest lose a lot of the soul the originals had. The lack of unique weather effects are certainly a shame, and the lighting can often be quite boring, but we know they're capable of doing better. Overall though, I do like them a fair bit, despite their shortcomings. Monster Hunter games have you complete quests that are traditionally organised into different tiers. The single player low rank village would have 6 tiers, while the multiplayer low rank hub has 3 and the high rank hub has 4. Usually the village is where the bulk of the story takes place, with the low rank hub basically having nothing and the high rank hub having a very light plot. The hub quests would have monster health scaled for around 2.5 players, which means a solo hunter would struggle and things would get easier with more people. World instead opted for a unified quest structure where all of it could be completed single and multiplayer, using a new mechanic where hunters could call others for help during a quest, and monster health would dynamically scale depending on how many people were on the quest. The story takes place continually, from the start of low rank all the way to the final boss of high rank, which makes for a longer narrative and lets them do unconventional things, like save the flagship monster for late high rank, to really build the anticipation. Rise attempts to combine the 2 structures of the older games and World, single player village quests, but also multiplayer hub quests. As always, these can be played solo, but this time also have dynamic scaling like World. The Rise developers made some more deliberate adjustments as a result of the differences. The village quests still have a lot of story content, but the monster health in them is made dramatically lower than normal to make them easier and something of an extended tutorial. This is because hub quests can scale, which means that the low rank hub quests can serve as standard difficulty single player quests. Something that would frustrate people in the older games is that the low rank hubs would more or less be a complete repeat of the village content, but just condensed, so beating the village and moving on to hub means you would have to do the exact same content again. Rise averts this issue thanks to special licensed quests. These are unlocked at certain intervals while clearing through the village ranks, and beating each one will automatically clear an entire rank in the low hub, which saves a lot of repetition. The plot of Rise is split between the village and high rank hub, which has more story content than before, including real cutscenes, which excluding World is a series first. Rise going back to the old key quest structure also gave way to a new upgrade. Older Monster Hunter games would force you to clear a list of key quests, but they would not tell you what they were. You either had to clear them all, get lucky, or look them up online. Rise tells you which ones are mandatory, but there's often more key quests than are required to complete, which allows you to skip monsters that you might not feel like fighting. It's a great feature for those who don't want to fight Basarios, for instance. Now, this all sounds well and good, but sadly it could have been executed a lot better. For one, the village quests are really easy. I mean, that's fine for a tutorial, but there's a lot of these quests, and it's where you can encounter a lot of the monsters for the first time. They just die so fast, and I think it would have been better if they were just normal. It doesn't make for a great first impression. Magnamalo is a huge victim of this, unfortunately. His story relevance is entirely limited to the village, and yes, his health in this quest is massively reduced too. It's the opposite of Nargacuga, who was intentionally held back until high rank in order to build tension, hype and stakes. Magnamalo is encountered in the 4-star village and killed very quickly, and that's kind of the end of it. Yeah, you encounter him again in HR7, where he's fairly formidable, but the wind is just completely gone from his sails. Previous single player villages were easy of course, but not to this degree. Possible Third does the same thing as Rise, where Zenoga is the final boss of the village, but he's much more challenging. Village is where the story is too, so you kind of have to do it to get the whole experience, and thus first encounter the monsters in their absolute weaker than normal state. I think for more casual players this also creates a dramatic difficulty spike, as they'll beat Village and the special license quests, and then go straight to high rank hub, where monster attack and especially health is much higher than what they're used to, as opposed to the more natural progression of low to high rank hub. High rank hub also is not immune from issues though, because there's a massive content problem. I said earlier that the special license quests avoid the issue of having to play through repeated content, which should in theory keep things fresh as you progress through the game. Unfortunately, high rank has very few exclusive monsters, and as such, you're mostly refighting the same guys you just fought, and most of the high rank upgrades are not very apparent. Pre-updates, and not counting special bosses like Ibushi, there were only 3 high rank exclusive monsters, one of them being Gyratotus. From the beginning, this was actually one of my major disappointments with Rise, because it's something that games like 4 Ultimate, Portable Third and even World do quite well, and it makes getting through Rise's HR4 and 5 a big slog, especially because it's filled with monsters who can't really fight back against the Silkbinds in major ways. Another content problem is that there's not that many quests per rank, only 2 pages at most. As someone who loves going through these in the older Monster Hunter games, this was disappointing. On the other hand, high rank has many quests that unlock additional switch skills, and it can be nice to go through and unlock them all, seeing as the rewards are quite tangible. Rise also has free hunting expeditions, which essentially just let you vibe in the locales and hunt monsters until you're ready to leave. It's fun, and they're executed just fine. Let's talk about the Rampages. The story of Monster Hunter Rise centers around the people of Kamura Village trying to figure out why huge hordes of monsters keep trying to tear it all down. After the last rampage 50 years ago almost wiped out the village, they built a huge stronghold to help them fight off the next one. And this is a brand new quest type in Rise. They take place in these huge strongholds, lined with installations such as ballistae, cannons and machine guns, with barriers to block monsters. Your task is to repel these hordes using installations and your own weapons. Up to 5 at once can be present, and they all have different roles. Some are dedicated to breaking down the barriers, some attack you directly, and some are just flyers. You can call upon the aid of certain prophilic Kamura villagers to assist you, and they can massively help turn the tide. Most of the time, it's effective to just blast a monster with installations, but occasionally, a counter gong will go off, which massively boosts your weapon attack power and allows you to fight the monsters face to face. There are sub-objectives to fulfill, where upon doing so, will automatically upgrade the installations, and victory is achieved by beating the leader of the pack, which is usually a monster. There are, however, special rampages where the leader of the pack is either Wind Serpent Ibushi or a special Apex monster. These are high rank exclusive, and there were 3 Apexes at launch. They're tougher and scarier than their standard forms and have new abilities. These rampages span 2 whole areas of the stronghold rather than 1. Beating rampages rewards you with special tickets that can be used to apply different buffs to weapons. So that's a very brief rundown of what rampages are and how they work. I've long considered making a separate video about them, because they're probably the most disliked new mechanic I've ever seen in a Monster Hunter game. People hate them, to the point they didn't even return for Sunbreak. I did have an outline for a Rampage video script, but I realised that 90% of the whole thing would just be me thoroughly explaining how Rampages work, when the issues everyone has with them can be distilled into a single sentence. Rampages are too easy, but they feel too hard. That's a bit of an unfixable problem. Rampages are basically impossible to fail if you even have a basic idea of what you should be doing. The gates have a lot of health and the monsters don't take a lot to repel. Their AI is quite simplified compared to normal hunts, so they're nowhere near as oppressive compared to normal, which is a good thing. But god, there can be so many of them. Zinogres, Tigrexes, multiple flying Basils, maybe a Rajang and 2 Ragnakadakis or Anjanaths charging the gates. It's so much to deal with that it really does get overwhelming. This gets easier in multiplayer, where you can easily split up, but it doesn't solve the difficulty problem, or the lack of difficulty problem. And even though Rampages feel overwhelming, they're not actually hard. Hell, you don't even need to beat the final monster. If you've done enough sub-objectives when the time expires, you're all good. So there's no real challenge to overcome, but they also don't feel that enjoyable for people to go through. I personally do end up having fun whenever I have to do a rampage, once I get the hang of things and I'm methodically taking down targets, but I always dread them. Rise only has 3 mandatory rampages, 2 if you skip the village. To unlock all the content, you have to do around 8. For 100%, you have to do 40 total, but most people realistically aren't going to do that. From this perspective, they're a bit like Monster Hunter Tries underwater combat, a huge thing that took a lot of time to create, but also not something you have to do a whole lot of. I'll say that I disagree with one of the major criticisms I see regarding rampages, specifically the Apex ones. I mentioned earlier that they have 2 areas of the stronghold, and letting the second gate fall will cause the whole thing to fail. When the Apex shows up, they'll immediately destroy the first gate with a huge attack no matter how well you've protected it, which moves the fight to the second area. People do not like this. They say, oh well that felt like a waste of time, what was the point of protecting the first gate if it gets destroyed so easily? See, the thing is, because rampages are so easy, people generally don't let the first gate fall on its own. But what happens if you do? Well, the monsters will just stop arriving at the first area entirely, and will show up instead at the second, attacking that gate. And so when the Apex arrives, they will also launch his or her devastating attack on that gate too. And honestly, it's so much damage that it does actually put you at severe risk of failing the quest. I get why people assume it's a flaw, but it isn't. It's actually a good thing that the Apex unleashes hell on the first gate. Still, rampages are not great, and have a lot of problems baked in that make it clear why the mechanic didn't come back for the expansion. I respect Ichinose and his team for trying something so crazy, a tower defense in a Monster Hunter of all things. Sometimes these things just don't work out, but we did get the followers out of it, so that's awesome. Rise's main hub world and base of operations is Kamura, a Japan-inspired village well renowned for its high quality steel. The place is next to the sea, surrounded by mountains, and it looks very beautiful. The architecture of the buildings is nice, the music is peaceful, and structurally it's very well organised. All your main facilities are within easy access of each other. You talk to Hinoa the quest maiden for village quests. Kaguro the merchant is right next to her, you can buy items from him. Hamon the blacksmith for your weapons and armour is not too far away either. And Yomogi the chef for your bunny dango is within Wirebug distance. Rather than traditional meals like in World, Rise has you order bunny dango to buff yourself before a quest. Dango are these dumplings served on a skewer that come in all kinds of different flavours and colours. When ordering them in Rise, you get a cute cutscene of Yomogi and her feline friends preparing them, with the infamous Bunny Dango song playing. I've seen a fair bit of hate of the dango over the years, on the grounds that they don't look nearly as beefy and grand as World or even for Ultimate meals. I do kind of agree, but at the same time, it's a very practical system on the gameplay front. You pick 3 different dango for your buffs and that's that. Quite a bit simpler than what World had going on. What's cool about Kamura is that the Gathering Hub can easily be accessed with barely even a loading screen. It's just a very short transition. The hub is really nice. It has a giant cherry blossom tree in the middle, and ordering dango from here has a different animation. There's a connected prep area to easily forge armour and decorations too. On the other side of Kamura is the Buddy Plaza, where you can manage your palicos and palamutes, recruit more of them, train, send them on expeditions. It's a cute place with some really nice music, and a short boat ride away is the training area, the only place in Kamura that takes time to load in, because it allows you to use your weapons. You can practice attacks either on targets or the Toadversary, which is a big mechanical clockwork Tetranodon. It takes real damage, has hit zones, and can be programmed to attack you, either by stomping or firing a projectile. It's great for practicing silk binds and counters. You can also adjust the Wirebugs to give you infinite recharges, letting you really mess around with them here. Another cool thing about Kamura is that you can freely choose the music for each area. You can change the Buddy Plaza's theme to Magnamalo's, for instance. It's nice customization. You can also decorate your room in the village with pictures taken with the game's camera, as well as wooden carvings of the monsters unlocked by collecting enough relic records. It's pretty cool. The only real downsides of Kamura in my opinion are the lack of a day-night cycle, and that there's a lot of invisible walls that make wirebugging around less fun than it could be. I also wonder if these black sections separating the areas are necessary. They look a bit off. But overall, it's probably one of the best villages in the entire series. Monster Hunter plots have never been anything to write home about, but they have been getting better and better over time. Tries was simple, but had a really cool plot twist. 4's was actually pretty great, and World's story, while a bit in your face, was enjoyable. Rise's story is handled in an interesting way. It's more involved than most Monster Hunter games, but obviously lower budget than World. As mentioned earlier, the first half of the story is in the village quests, and is fairly simple. The rampage is starting again, we need to start getting ready. Go and hunt these monsters, then you repel a rampage, only for Magnamalo to show up right at the end. You're told that Magnamalo showed up during the first rampage 50 years ago and broke through the final line of defense, and would have wiped out Kamura Village if not driven back by Hamon the blacksmith. There's interesting history there. You kill Magnamalo a rank later, you won, roll credits, literally. The high rank story continues on from Magnamalo's defeat. From the beginning, the villagers had no idea why the rampages were happening. They knew that Magnamalo wasn't the cause, he would just show up to feed on the stragglers. They soon found out. It's a giant elder dragon, known as Wind Serpent Ibushi, and what's worse, he forms a psychic connection with Hinoa the Quest Maiden, causing her to become a mouthpiece for his thoughts. This causes her immense pain, and you have to drive away Ibushi before any permanent damage is done. It turns out Ibushi has a wife called Thunder Serpent Narwa, who then forms a similar connection with Hinoa's sister, Minato. Eventually you locate Narwa and cause her to fall down a hole, which defeats her. We won, except the rampages don't stop. It's revealed later that not only have Narwa and Ibushi survived, they figured out the nature of their connections with the twins and are trying to coordinate a meeting, which can only end in catastrophe, to be continued. This is a very abridged version of the story, and my description probably sounds a little bit crazy and rushed, but it's also kind of like that in game. Rise's village quests being a very long tutorial means Magnamalo is encountered and defeated really quickly and never feels like a real threat. Previous Monster Hunters did a great job hyping up their flagship monsters, usually by thrusting them upon you far before you'd expect to encounter them. Tri, Portable Third, 4 and World do this. Generations did it 4 times. Magnamalo is different because it's literally only a cutscene, which sucks. Ooh, we narrowly escape within inches of our lives, well, what the hunter does. I mean, I was just sitting back, not even touching the controller. And of course, Magnamalo himself is killed pretty quickly. The second half of the plot is held back by the storytelling being pretty, lackluster. It's mostly told to us by Elder Fugen and Guildmaster Hojo standing there and telling us the information. This is how we learn about Narwa, for instance. She doesn't even get an introductory story cutscene like Ibushi. This results in crazy new concepts like the resonance between the serpents and the twins not really being handled all that well. It's just told to you for the most part. There are parts of it that I really do like, and I think a really great story could have come out of all this. For one, the characters are great, and they have a lot more to them than in previous games. They have actual names for one, and personality traits, and relate to each other in different ways. For example, Hinoa is basically perfect. She's pretty, outgoing, smart, everyone likes her. Hinoa's twin sister Minato feels the same way towards her, and is fiercely protective while also feeling dramatically inferior to her. Minato is introverted, not very confident in herself. As a child she was shy and always hid behind Hinoa during conversations. The Palamutes in the Buddy Plaza wag their tails at Hinoa, but growl at Minato. Hinoa has the power to sense the thoughts of others around her, but Minato doesn't. These aspects of her character are gleaned from just talking to her and the other villagers, but they're also shown through different means. She's a budding artist who gets frustrated because all her drawings end up being too cutesy, and these drawings are on the Monster Hunter Rise website, in the form of a web manual that explains key mechanics about the game. All her drawings have this style, except for when she draws Hinoa, which leads to stunning works of art like this one here. She is seen using a lance during rampages, which is a defensive weapon that emphasises how she wants to protect Hinoa. Her inferiority complex comes to a head after Ibushi resonates with Hinoa. Minato feels powerless, as she can't help her sister, who suffers pretty badly from the connection. But when Narwa resonates with Minato, she gets really happy. Turns out, she is as good as her sister, and does have that same power. It's an interesting set of character traits that does end up mattering in the story. What's amusing is that Hinoa isn't really perfect. She loves to eat, to the point she orders up to 50 bunny dongos a day. She once tried to become a hunter, but it did not work out because she just eats all the rations before the quest begins, and even then, she didn't want to proceed after realising that the dango shop couldn't deliver to her while she would be hunting. Minato has to cook actual meals for her, so she doesn't starve. All these traits makes the characters really fun to think about. They're not just facilities you access quests or buy items from. The thing about Kamura Village is that all the main villagers are supposed to feel like an extended family of sorts. They all grew up together and have a history. Take Hamon the blacksmith, he grew up with Fugen and Hojo, and as said earlier, they faced the previous Rampage 50 years ago. Hamon was the one who repelled Magnamalo. The buddy handler Iori is actually Hamon's grandson, who he disapproves of for not following his footsteps as a blacksmith. Iori's palamutes were also named by Fugen. The villagers all have detailed backgrounds that are gleaned from talking to them, such as Rondine the trader from overseas, who you sort of figure out is actually at Kamura for nefarious reasons. She wants to poach Master Hamon for his steel forging techniques. There's also minor villagers you can see out and about, like the feline Okari, who unloads boat shipments and delivers them around the village. A fun detail is that he loves Yomogi's tea shop, and you can sometimes find him gazing at it longingly while on his run, or even relaxing there on breaks. In your house, there's a feline called Fukashiki, and every quest rank, he'll tell you some hidden gossip he's picked up about the villagers. And this is actually where you find out a lot of these hidden facts about the villagers that you wouldn't normally be able to find. For example, Yomogi was not actually born in Kamura. She was brought to the village in a basket by a Wyverian as a baby, and only Fugen, Hojo and the twins know where she's really from. The Wyverian's identity isn't really stated, but if you look at how the village is structured, Kagaro's shop is facing the tea shop, as if he's keeping watch. Even our hunter was born in Kamura Village, which is actually unlike previous games where there's always some unknown guy who's just shown up. This time you're actually supposed to know these people and consider them family too. That's why they all have names this time. Rise did have the bones for a great story, and they definitely put a lot of thought into it, like with the relic records, but unless you really dig in, I think it's hard to appreciate it all, especially with how the story is presented to people. The lead writer, Hiroshi Yamashita, said that the theme of Rise's story was succession. The village elders failed to stop the first rampage, so they built the stronghold in preparation for the next one, and when it arrived, they passed that responsibility down to you, the next generation, someone who grew up in the village. This all kind of happens in the first 4 low-rank village tier quests, so it feels rather rushed. The story attempts to develop character arcs for Yomogi and Yori, and those two can help during rampages, but when Magnamalo shows up, there's simply no match for him and have to run. This leads to them feeling a bit useless, but eventually, they realise that they can help the village in other ways. Yomogi can keep supplying dango, and Yori can keep training buddies. Those jobs also help defend Kamura from the rampage. It's fine, but it happens across 2 or so cutscenes, so it's kind of basic. But it does tie into the succession theme, in that the youth of the village are now growing into their roles. Something cool Rise does with this theme is contrast Kamura Village with that of the Storm Serpents. Narwa and Ibushi want to procreate and have lots of children, the process of which will destroy the world. Bits of an exaggeration, but they create rampages and apex monsters wherever they go. The villagers want their successors to protect, while the serpents want their successors to destroy. A very interesting parallel indeed, and one that sadly probably gets overlooked due to the story being a bit underbaked. Monster Hunter Rise's setting is very much inspired by Japanese culture. Capcom is a Japanese company, and the vast majority of the staff that work on these games are from Japan, but generally the games are inspired by a lot of different cultures. Try's Muga Village is inspired by Pacific Islanders. For Ultimate has Aztec theming everywhere. Portable Third leaned very much into Japan, and Rise did the same, but to an even greater extent. It's baked into so many different aspects of the game. The architecture seen in Kamura Village and the shrine ruins, with the gable roofs and the torii gates everywhere. The Wirebugs' general shape and colour is inspired by a Magatama. The characters' names are largely Japanese too, and the new monsters are inspired by Japanese yokai. Great Izuchi is a Kamaitachi, Agnosom is a Kasa Obaki, Tetranodon is a Kappa, and Gosarag is an Oni. These are intentional inspirations, and even the ones that aren't based off an explicit yokai are still very much Japan inspired. Magnamalo looks like an armor-clad samurai warrior, and is based off a tiger, which is an Asian animal. In fact, during the lead up to Rise, they would often tease new monsters on social media, using very crude drawings by Ichinose, and people were kind of able to guess what the new monster would be like based on the drawing. Big nose? That's clearly a Tengu. A fish woman with horns? That's going to be Himweu. The Japanese influence can also be seen in Rise's introduction cutscenes. Every monster except for the apexes have one, and when your language is set to Japanese, they're narrated by a professional biwa player, as if he's telling a ghost story. In English, this was localized to be a simple poem, since there was no real way for an English actor to match the tone.
Rends heaven in twain with a final flash.
Even a staff member responsible for Rise's localization found difficulty in trying to match the vibes, and at one point just wanted to keep the biwa performance for the English versions. Personally, I find all this stuff really cool. I had to research it for the Narwa and Ibushi video, and I learnt a lot. It was really interesting to see what inspired the dragons and their gear. People were generally quite positive towards all this too, but something that ended up being quite contentious was the music, because in Rise, they composed every single track to feature vocals. All of them. This was a demand by Ichinose. Sometimes the vocals in these tracks can be very in your face, in the background, or quite subtle, from singing loudly, softly, or just chanting in the background. They also tend to use a lot of Japanese instruments, such as the flutes, taiko drums, the shamisen and biwa. Personally, I think that the original tracks for Rise tend to be quite good. The Kamura Village theme and related areas, the shrine ruins, Frost Islands, and especially the original monster themes. I love Magnamalo's, Ibushi's, Narwa's. Where it gets a bit hit or miss is with the remix tracks. Like World, the composers for Rise remade every single track for all the monsters, rather than simply reuse the originals, and as such, they all have vocals and or Japanese instruments. Nargacuga's new theme has really nice sounding female vocalists, but they kind of take over the parts of the original track that I really liked, and as such, it sounds worse than the other versions to me. The Iceborne version was the perfect recreation, so this was disappointing. Zenogre's new theme was fantastic however, the chants really add to the whole track. I'm surprised by how well the flutes are incorporated, and I love that new section they add at the end. The violin works really well. I still think the original is the strongest version, but this one is great. I am conflicted on Mizutsune's because the original was so full of energy, while this one feels a lot quieter. And the female vocalist replaces the bamboo flutes of the original, which was something I really liked in that version. Even the shamisen segment halfway through gets replaced by vocals which I'm just not the biggest fan. Rajang's theme makes use of a distinctly male vocalist, which works well. It's not enough to save the track, but I do like that touch. I really like the use of vocals in Chameleos, Kushala and Seostra's themes. They actually sound incredible, and work with the instruments so well. Val's tracks, however, has the same problem as Mizutsune's where the vocals replace the instruments from the original, and the whole thing just sounds quieter and less energetic. Basilgo's is probably the most interesting comparison to make, because his theme is a one-to-one remake of the world version, with vocals, different beats and instruments. I'm still not really sure which I prefer here. Aside from the vocals being either distracting or detracting from the rest of the instruments, another issue was that it felt like they were so overused that they no longer felt special. In the past, vocals were often used for the most dangerous of threats in order to set them apart. Fatalis' theme, for instance, was pretty much just the Monster Hunter's Forest and Hills theme, now with vocals. In fact, just before Rise, Iceborne Safi Jiva had a theme with some of the greatest vocals ever heard in a Monster Hunter game. Perhaps Zenogre should not have the same gravitas as this guy. At the same time, Rise does use vocals to differentiate some of the stronger monsters. I mentioned Rajang and the male vocalist, but Narwa and Ibushi's themes have actual singing in a spoken language, which definitely sets them apart. I also think the problem with some of Rise's remix tracks, being mid or bad, isn't really exclusive to it. That's a problem World and Iceborne ran into as well. I don't think either game has really topped the portable third Zenogre theme, for instance. It's worth mentioning that Rise does not reuse a single track from an older game. Everything composed and recorded was entirely for this entry, even music as simple as the cooking theme. This really lets the vocal motif throughout the soundtrack stand out. On that note, an important aspect about Rise is that it's objectively the most ambitious game in the portable series of Monster Hunter, and feels far less derivative of its fellow console entry than normal, which would be World. Generally, it's the main games that tend to be big and new, while the portable games reuse content from them while also adding their own. This means that they usually end up bigger, but are also very similar. Portable Third has all of Tri's locales and most of its monsters, and Generations carried over a lot of Monster Hunter 4's content too. Rise, on the other hand, doesn't carry over from World nearly as much. It has reused animations, yes, and got to carry over some monsters from World and Iceborne, as well as armor and weapon models. But because Rise ran on a different engine, it essentially meant that the developers had to recode everything from scratch. A more tangible example of Rise largely standing on its own 2 feet would be that every locale is unique to this game. The Flooded Forest and Sandy Plains were of course from the older games, but they were not ported over. Instead, they were completely reimagined for Rise, which is significant when you consider that previous portable entries would mostly have returning locales, with only one new addition. There's other factors too. Rise's monster icons are in a completely unique style, designed to look like they were painted with swift brush strokes. They took some getting used to, but they're genuinely really cool, although some are a bit weird. But it's definitely a departure from the standard style, which is returning to Wilds. I've mentioned this a couple of times now, but Rise was designed to be the ultimate portable Monster Hunter game. Before World, the series would do okay on consoles, but would absolutely thrive on handhelds. The quest structure made it perfect for pick up and play sessions, and it's where the series really grew, particularly on the PSP. The aim with Rise was to make a Monster Hunter game that could truly be played whenever, wherever. So how did they do this? First of all, because Rise can be played on a much smaller screen than the TV, a special user interface had to be designed in order to be very readable. If you compare Worlds to Rises, you'll see that the latter game is bigger, brighter, and has backdrops on each line of text, which makes it all much more readable. I said earlier that monster health was reduced compared to the other games. This meant that clearing quests wouldn't take as long, which is good for short journeys. Another factor that reduces quest times is locale traversal, which is faster than ever. In particular thanks to the palamutes that let you quickly chase down monsters. Another important aspect is the tracking. In the older games, you had to find the monster first and then tag them with a paintball. People largely do not look back at this mechanic with fondness, because looking for the monster would often take ages depending on different factors like luck, or if the monster went away before you reached their location. World had a tracking system that would guide you to the monster, and eventually automatically display them on the map after many hunts. Rise just shows the monster automatically right from the start, thanks to your Kahoot's companion. Granted, undiscovered monsters show up as a question mark, but eventually you'll always begin a quest knowing who is present and where they are, allowing you to beeline towards them and save more time. This does help with wyvern riding, since you know where to pick up help along the way. When playing the older portable games, you'd often be in the same room with others on their PSPs or 3DSs, and be able to physically talk to each other. The Rise developers wanted to preserve that dynamic, even for those playing online, and the result of this is that hunters speak full sentences on Rise depending on the situation, picking up items, carving, entering a fight, witnessing a turf war. It's a bit of an adjustment, but it's quite cool. All the voices have different personalities, and there's some prominent game and anime voice actors there. They can also be freely turned off for yourself and or your friends. We talked about Rise being ambitious, but what about its status as a game built for the Nintendo Switch? The Switch was the target platform, which meant that Capcom prioritized it. On the Switch, Rise runs at a stable 30 frames per second, and while its resolution is not native, it doesn't ever drop, and the loading times are very reasonable. We already saw the impressive village quick travel, and most quests load in less than 20 seconds, a massive decrease from Monster Hunter World's minute-long load times on the PlayStation 4. And this allows people to quickly enter and exit quests with ease, which is important when going for quick sessions. Rise kind of disproves the notion that realism as an art style couldn't work on the Switch. The character models look amazing, same with the armors, weapons and environments. It's rare to see such a good looking open game like this here, and what's interesting is that I rarely notice assets pop in, which is a huge issue for open games. It absolutely happens in Rise, but it's never in your face, and it took until Sunbreak for me to notice a really blatant example. We talked about Rise's open zone locales earlier, that the Shrine Ruins is almost flexing that they were able to achieve this on the Switch. Open zone or open world games are not uncommon on Switch, but they either don't look good or run poorly, and the games that avoid those issues are either made by Nintendo or are doing way less than Rise. Because this game has multiplayer, with each hunter having their own individual weapons, armor, switch skills and items. Multiple large and small monsters present on a locale at the same time, who can all be fought, killed and carved in individual locations. What's even more impressive is the draw distance. You can see monsters from incredibly far away, and they seem to be fully detailed too. We also have to remember the Rampages, which can have up to 5 of them at once. All this, with the game having similar combat to World, except this time hunters can swing around and run up every wall. The Rise developers have frequently spoken about the challenges they overcame when working with the Switch. Generations Ultimate was the first game in the series to be on the platform, but it was a 3DS port. Rise was an original game scoped for the system, which would be a whole different beast. They spent a lot of time optimizing the CPU and GPU load, memory, loading times and more. Because Rise was the first Monster Hunter to run on the RE engine, they couldn't just reuse code from World or the older games, and had to rewrite it all from scratch. Ichinose has described the engine as being efficient, but it still must have been a struggle. When Rise started development around 2016, they were committed to using segmented areas like in the old games, because they did not think the Switch could handle open zones. They had completed work on the Shrine Ruins and moved on to the Frost Islands when the decision to change everything was made, so not that much had to be scrapped, but it was still a crazy thing to pull off, even more so when you consider that Wirebugs, with all the crazy movement, was something they already decided on. I cannot imagine Rise with the Wirebugs and segmented areas when I think about swinging and running around the open maps. They just work together so well. Likewise, Kamura Village at some point was going to have loading times between its different areas. According to Rise's lead programmer, the village initially had longer loading times when moving around, which is not exactly uncommon when looking at the older games and even Astera. But at some point, they figured out how to take the technology that allowed for seamless locales and use it for the village, which allowed for minimal loading times. In Monster Hunter Generations, you could not leave the gathering hub while connected to online servers, and you'd have to go offline to head back to the village. This was also the case in Rise until those optimizations were made. What's more, is that you can freely see your multiplayer friends within all areas of Kamura Village. This is basically a series first, and it's awesome. You can even bring them into the training area. It makes the whole place seem so much more alive and important, because normally villages would tend to take a backseat once you were in the online content. Regarding the Nintendo Switch though, there are some notable drawbacks. Small monsters at a distance will animate at half the frame rate, which does not look good with, say, the Rampages. When using the Switch's clipping feature, a lot of Rise footage will have tons of frame drops that were not there when you were actually playing the game, likely because the system was being pushed to the limit. That's not to say Rise doesn't have frame rate issues at all. It's generally consistent, but some areas, such as the flooded forest, can get a bit unstable, although never catastrophic. There are some issues where it's unclear whether the Switch was at fault, or if the developers decided not to implement them the same as in World or the other games. Monster AI when roaming is much less elaborate than it was in World. In that game, monsters can be seen casually hunting, resting, and are always on the move. With Rise, they just move to an area and wait there for a while before moving on. Sometimes they'll do a special animation, but it's hard to see because they'll become aggressive soon after seeing you, something that was not the case in World, where monsters had varying degrees of aggression. For Rise monsters, they'll spot you and then a few seconds later the fight will begin. There's also the chase themes fiasco. Chase themes play whenever a monster moves to a different area in World, like a less intense version of the battle themes, and they'll transition back when you catch up. In Rise, the chase theme instead plays within a certain proximity to the monster, which means you'll only hear it if you're hot on its heels. Which is kind of baffling because how on earth would we hear Valstraxes, for instance? To be honest, I don't know if a lot of these specific examples are Switch limitations. Rise has a lot of smaller examples compared to World that sort of make me wonder if recoding so much in a new engine just created slightly different outcomes for everything. The monster aggression stuff might also not have been a big priority for Rise's developers as it was with World. After all, that game was trying to create a living, breathing world with realistic monster and animal behaviour. Rise's intention is to get you into battle as soon as possible. Maybe from that standpoint, making the monsters aggressive is a good thing. Overall, the vision Ichinose and his team had for Rise was really interesting and incredibly ambitious. They took some huge risky swings that gave the game its own unique identity compared to Monster Hunter World, which is hard to say of many of the previous portable games. And it's so impressive that they got this thing working on the Switch. It's easily among the most technically impressive games on that system. Monster Hunter Rise was quite polarizing for a time. A lot of it for minor reasons mentioned before, but here we're really going to get into what soured people on the game. Rise had an extensive post-launch update period, where Capcom added new content for a good year after release. This is normal for Monster Hunter games, even from the very beginning, but World was the first one to actually add 4 monsters after release, which was important because World's roster was kind of Iceborne in particular went absolutely ballistic with this, adding so many brand new monsters with crazy production values, really ending the game with a bang. So what did Rise get? Shortly before release, it was announced that Kamelios would be coming to the game 1 month later as a free title update. This was a normal time frame for the first title update, and what a great choice Kamelios is. And now he'd finally get to join Kushala and Teostra, who had not yet been confirmed for Rise but surely would be in the game. What was really interesting is that the roadmap advertised Kamelios, several more monsters, an unlocked HR cap and other features. The Rise launch trailer confirmed we'd be getting an Apex Rathalos. Our Zoras and Mizutsune were the only ones confirmed at the time, and when the game released, people found there was also an Apex Rathian. A trailer for Title Update 2 aired on the 27th of April, just over a month after Rise released. It announced Apex Diablos, Rathalos again, as well as Teostra and Kushala Daora. Yeah, funny story, those two were not in Rise at launch. For the first time since the 3rd generation, they had skipped a Monster Hunter game. This meant that Narwa and Ibushi were the only Elder Dragons in Rise, but now 3 more were finally being added. It was weird to see these two get hyped up like this, considering they'd been in every prior game, including World, but you know, whatever. The trailer showed off other things without really highlighting them. Almudron was now on Rampages, which wasn't possible before, as was Magnamalo, which is kind of crazy. Feeding on the Rampage is his whole thing, why would that not be there in the beginning? We would also be able to fight Apex monsters in regular quests, which was also not a thing at launch. The reason I said there were 8 mandatory Rampages earlier is that you have to beat the Apex and the Rampage in order to unlock the hunting quest for them. Layered armor was also added with the update, which was really nice. It took World and Iceborne some time to get that feature, but with Rise it only took a month. It also took a month to get actual Elder Dragons to kill, but whatever. The roadmap had a very mysterious etc. after Apex Rathalos. This ended up being Basilgoose, who came with the update with no announcement. Those who had beaten all the village quests were immediately told about him, due to Elder Fugen giving them a quest to kill him. He's also a HR7 quest, and will appear as an invader for ranks HR5 and above. Speaking of HR, what's with the unlocked cap? Well, since 3 Ultimate, whenever you've beaten the final boss, the hunter rank continues to go up as it's no longer tied to quest rank. From here, it's more like leveling up in an RPG, from HR7 to whatever number deemed by how many quests you've completed. It can jump to 30, 50, maybe even 100 if you've really been at it. This has been the case for every game except for Rise, where you just stayed at 7 after beating Narwa, because the cap increase came with the title update. What kind of sucks is that when it finally arrived, everyone's hunter rank simply jumped to 8, which meant that the hunter rank points were not accumulating in the background for the entire month Rise was out. Someone who had rushed to the final boss was now at the same rank as someone who had completed every quest in the game. What's worse is that the latter person had no activities to casually do as they grinded up their hunter rank, because this was necessary to unlock the new content. As of the 2.0 update, hitting HR20 unlocks Kamelios, hitting 30 unlocks Kushala Daora, and 40 unlocks Teostra. You need to beat each dragon to keep advancing the hunter rank, but points will actually accumulate from here, so if you decide to kill 100 Magnamalos at HR20 and then beat Kamelios, you'll shoot to HR30 immediately. As fights, the 3 dragons are a lot of fun. Kushala is massively improved from World, Teostra has some of his Iceborne attacks, and Rise's fire graphics look really good on him. Kamelios was wonderfully remade too. He's still dangerous, but also retains his invisibility and sprays mist into the air. Unlike a lot of Rise's environmental details, this one is a real step above the older games, where it would just be some weird obstructive overlay. This time, the map does actually get quite foggy. Basilgoose is a lot of fun too. While he's still an invader, he no longer casually dive bombs into hunts, which is a bit disappointing. But his fight is altered from the world version, in ways that make him different but retain the challenge. Here his bombs have fixed patterns, in terms of how they drop, which makes him more consistent but still tricky. The roadmap showed Title Update 3 was coming in May, featuring several new monsters and a new ending. Do you recall the story segment where I mentioned that Rise kind of just ends with the possessed twins meeting? This upcoming update would conclude the story, and the trailer aired on May 27th. The first thing shown off was Valstrax, the Sky Comet dragon from Generations. Except it wasn't Valstrax, it was Crimson Glow Valstrax, a variant. Very odd considering the original was nowhere to be seen, but hey, that's a really cool monster to add to the game. The trailer also showed off a new Apex Enoga, as well as normal quests for Apex Rathalos and Diablos. The final portion of the trailer teased a reunion of Narwa and Ibushi, but ended without showing what was going to happen, leaving it a mystery until the update finally arrived. At HR 50, a quest called The All-Mother is unlocked, which has you face off against Ibushi. He gets injured, and you enter a new arena where Narwa is residing. Upon witnessing the injured Ibushi, Narwa kills and absorbs his energy, transforming into a new variant, Narwa the All-Mother, the true final boss of Rise. Because the Storm Serpents are the source of the Rampage, defeating Narwa the All-Mother formally concludes the story. Crimson Glow Valstrax is unlocked at HR 100. He's very similar to the original Valstrax, but he can charge up his wings, which gives them enhanced properties. He can be found in every single locale, and what's really cool is that he can sometimes ambush other monsters if he catches you fighting them. His area transitions are also very fast. What's quite interesting is that people initially assumed that Basilgoose couldn't do his bombing raids anymore because of Nintendo Switch limitations. Maybe it just couldn't handle that advanced monster AI on top of everything else. But Crimson Glow Valstrax does it just fine, so that means omitting it was a deliberate choice for Basil. Version 3.0 also added a new arena called the Infernal Springs. It was only used for 2 endgame quests, but events and later Sunbreak got more use out of it. With 3.0 being the last major update, it meant Crimson Glow Valstrax was the final monster added to Rise. It was all events quests after this. These 2 major updates were very meaty, but people did not like them. Why? Because they were blatantly cut from the game to release later. Why? Who knows? When DLC or updates are planned for a game and come out in a timely manner, it usually means they were set into motion before the game was actually released. This is normal practice because otherwise it just takes too long. Xenoblade Chronicles 3's Future Redeemed expansion released just over half a year after the base game, which itself had a lot of story gaps that the expansion story eventually filled. It was obviously planned even from the game's inception. However, Resident Evil Village's DLC was said by Capcom to have started development after the game had come out, and it was released 16 whole months later. Monster Hunter title updates are naturally planned and worked on to an extent before the game is out. Like with Deviljho, they showed him off before the game was out. They did the same for Rajang, and he was released with the whole Guiding Lands region. The developers obviously didn't make it all in a month, same with the Safi Jiva update. This is not the case with all of them. We know that monsters like Primordial Malzeno, for instance, were not initially planned, but they tend to be outliers. Releasing an update shortly after the game is released keeps the game in the news and conversations. It gives active players something new to do, and maybe convinces those who dropped it after the final boss to come back. Rajang and Deviljho can be fought in every map, and are quite challenging, which makes them pretty versatile from a content standpoint. The difference between World and Iceborne and Rise is that the prior game and expansion felt like complete experiences upon release, which was not the case with Rise. It's very hard to show now because this version of the game doesn't really exist anymore, but the game's already bare bones plot ended on a weak cliffhanger. There were no endgame activities, which was something 4, Generations and World had on release. No joke, the weapon trees all had question marks at the end for a whole month because you couldn't complete them. There were no killable Elder Dragons either because Ibushi and Narwa would always get away. Those 2 dragons are so emblematic of Rise's issues at launch. The description for Wind Resistance mentioned Koshala Deora's Dragonwind, and he wasn't even in the game. He was blatantly supposed to be there when it came out. There were also so many weird bugs like the charm table issue from 3 Ultimate had returned. So when the update finally dropped, it was like, yay, but also, are you being serious right now? That's an extreme level of holding back content. Both of these updates essentially just finished Rise. The new content was implemented into the game in such a way that is unconventional when you look at how World, Iceborne, and later even Sunbreak handled their title updates. Those games dump all the new content immediately after the final boss for you to sort of binge, but for Rise they added actual endgame hunter rank progression onto the game after it was out, so it kind of just continues where it left off with Narwa. Aside from the Wind Resistance description, you also have the Sandy Plains relic records which reference Crimson Glow Valstrax, but also a mural in the training area that depicts Apex Rathalos, Diablos and Zinogre. This doesn't necessarily mean those monsters were cut from the game. They might have always been intended to be fast updates, and these were just little hints, similar to how Iceborne's Guiding Lands updates were quite fast. Crimson Glow Valstrax also bears similarity to Rajang and Deviljho, being a significant monster but also an invader, who can be found in every locale. But Valstrax was also the HR 100 boss, which makes me think he was not intended to be an update. So here's the $1 million question, why the hell did they do this? Around launch, the prevailing opinion was that the COVID-19 pandemic had severely hampered development, and this was definitely true to an extent. It affected everyone. Iceborne had to delay Elatron and Fatalis, and there's zero doubt Rise had to shift around some things too. The marketing, for instance, was designed to be very online based because of the pandemic. But then, if significant content has to be delayed, then why release in March? Well, it's simple. Politics. The fiscal year ends in March, and April is where the major companies make their financial reports to investors. Releasing the game then allowed Capcom to include it in their reports, and because Rise was sure to be successful, they could end the year with a bang. Delaying it further would not let them do that until the next year. It objectively sucks for us, but you can kind of see why they did it. Maybe some hands were tied. On the other hand, I don't think this content was delayed because of COVID. That's to say, I don't think the developers were all, "Oh no, we won't be able to finish Koshada in time, delay him by a month." I have two guesses. The first is that no major monster title updates were planned for Rise, but for the reasons mentioned earlier, they decided to carve out content to have at least 2 updates. It would also serve as an interesting experiment to have a couple of big updates with lots of monsters, rather than many updates with only 1 each. The second guess is that Rise was meant to have actual updates, but the content was scrapped. But they still wanted some kind of update, so they did what they did. There's not much that backs this up, except for the Infernal Springs. It is a bit weird how they made a whole special arena with these really evil vibes and unique music, only to rarely use it. The springs are treated as Violet Mizutsune's arena in Sunbreak. Was he planned for Rise at some point? That's pure speculation from me. I don't think there's anything that really backs it up, but still. What makes me inclined towards my first guess, where there were no updates planned, is the rest of Rise's post-launch support after May 2021. It was fine. The 3.0 update trailer showed off a new roadmap, which had 3 Capcom collabs up until August. These were collaborations with Capcom, the developer and publisher of all the Monster Hunter games, but also Street Fighter, Resident Evil and more. The first collab was with Monster Hunter Stories 2 Wings of Ruin, in the form of a Palico costume of the character Tsukino. It was pretty cool, she has voice lines and everything. This was unlocked by beating an event quest where you faced off against the game's bird wyverns, with music from Stories 2 playing in the background. It was fairly easy but not too bad. The second Capcom collab was with Okami, in the form of a Palamute costume of the protagonist Amaterasu. Okami is a very beloved game from the Wii era. The quest was a bit boring, you had to gather scrolls while Okami music played in the background, but the costume itself is really well done. Amaterasu's weapon changes depending on whether you're using blunt or cutting, and he leaves behind flowers and petals while you're zooming around. The third collab was really cool, layered armor of Akuma from Street Fighter. It just turns you into the character. It's unlocked by beating Rajang in a special event quest, but what's cool about this is that there's 2 Rajangs on the map, one normal and another big and more powerful one, sleeping on the Shrine Ruin Central Mountain. You can choose which one to take on, since you only need to beat 1 Rajang. It's a cool gimmick. As for Akuma's armor, equipping a sword and shield turns him invisible, so when Akuma attacks, it looks like he's punching. These even have the punch sound effect, and certain silkbinds even have different animations, such as the Metsu Shoryugeki and the windmill. He has unique weapon poses, a different throwing knife animation, and even a different quest ending animation. It's really well done. All while this was happening, we were getting weekly event quests. They began in April 2021 with Update 2.0 and continued all the way to March 2022. These quests would often place monsters in different environments than you'd encounter them in the base game, effectively filling in the gaps in terms of content. For example, Koshada Deora could be encountered in the sandy plains through expeditions, but there was no official quest to encounter him there in a solo hunt until Tempest in the Desert. We'd also get quests such as dual apex hunts, special rampages, and generally just harder challenges than in the base game. The game was updated with these events in such a way that they would be downloaded to the system on a monthly basis, and then would unlock at specific weekly dates. This is because Rise was on the Nintendo Switch, a portable system that may not always have access to Wi-Fi. So as long as you had the most recent update, you would still get all the new events, even with no internet. In a given month, by doing all the event quests, you would usually receive the Capcom collab gear for that month, special guild card titles, a gesture or pose, stickers, an event armor set or piece of gear, and nothing. Yeah, some of these quests don't really give you anything aside from the challenge. So what came next? Well, a roadmap released after the Okami collab that showed 2 more Capcom collabs in the fall. Yeah, that's it. Up until now, many people, admittedly including myself at the time, believed that while the first 2 updates were just Capcom finishing up the game, we'd soon enough get some more substantial post-launch updates, similar to Wild and Iceborne. Monsters, what we're all here for. This roadmap dashed those hopes completely, and it became clear that Valstrax was the last one. Maybe we'd get something when the PC version released, but that didn't happen. Collab 4 was revealed to be Rush from Mega Man as a Palamute costume, unlocked by defeating a tiny Zinogre. Rush had different animations compared to the standard Palamute. Rocket boosting instead of running fast, teleporting instead of digging. The final Capcom collab was Arthur from the new Ghost and Goblins revival. Like Akuma, it turned you into Arthur, who definitely clashes with Rise's realistic art style in a funny way. Throwing knives were now changed into lances, and the armour was unlocked by beating Volvidon, Basarios and Rathalos. Something that excited people pre-release was the prospect of getting Nintendo collaborations again. There were so many of these in 4 Ultimates and Generations, but obviously none in World. Rise was on the Switch, so we would get more, right? No. In retrospect, Capcom was likely always planning a PC version, and maybe wanted as much content parity as possible. Sucks for those who wanted a Wolf Link Palamute though. Rise was lacking on non-Capcom collaborations in general, but the Sonic the Hedgehog quests in November 2021 were really cool. One of them had you collect rings in the Shrine Ruins, while Escape from the City played in the background. You had to grab 200 to win. You could take different routes to try and get the fastest score. There was a timer on the side with a ranking system, encouraging you to complete the quest as fast as possible, which is very much in the spirit of Sonic the Hedgehog. This collab had quite a few rewards. Beating the Rings quest would grant you materials to make Palico and Palamute's costumes, representing Sonic and Tails respectively. But depending on how fast you beat the stage, you could also unlock statues of Sonic, Tails and Knuckles for your room, which is pretty cool. That was a low rank quest. A high rank Nargacuga hunt called Super Shady Lookalike was also available. Live and Learn played in the background of this quest. The quest description reaffirms that Nargacuga is supposed to represent Shadow the Hedgehog. This quest grants you some Sonic drip for the hunter, which looks pretty damn good. All in all, a very good event. Shame that new players can't access it anymore. There were also a couple of Universal Studios Japan quests, one that was an Azoros Majority Rampage, and another that was a Magnamalo, Tetranodon and Azoros hunt. They granted you the same gear from the World collaboration, but this time there was a new Palamute outfit too, as well as a longsword to craft, which was actually the only event weapon in Rise. This content is also no longer accessible for new players. Around this time, Rise was getting quite a few event armors that were ported from World, such as the Gala or Diver suits, and then it all came to an end in March, with the final quest being a neat reference to Rise's demo, featuring the exact same monsters. Sunbreak's marketing had gone into full swing at this point, so in some ways it was the end of Rise. I would say that people were not satisfied with Rise's post-launch support, especially those coming from World, but also just the old games in general. The event quests were often not very interesting, and the collabs, while well done, looked kind of unimpressive compared to what we had in World. When Rise crossed over with Stories 2, you fought a bunch of bird wyverns. When World crossed over with Final Fantasy, you fought Behemoth. The rewards were also not great either. Most people care about cosmetics like layered armor, but a good chunk of Rise's rewards were not that. They were often gestures or poses, which I personally enjoy using. They're fun when goofing off with friends, but there were also stickers and guild card titles which just feel kind of lame. Especially because out of all the words, there was not heavy or wings, which that's really annoying for me. Meanwhile, World's post-launch support had so much layered armor every single update. World's event quests also would often have specific purposes behind them. Beat this quest to get certain jewels for your armor, or a crown-sized monster, or a higher chance of getting a rare drop. Rise did not really do this at all. I mean, maybe sometimes drop rates would be slightly enhanced, but nothing was really designed to encourage you to beat them. And of course, having no new monsters after Val Strikes was really disappointing. After World, and especially Iceborne, set the bar so high. I dismissed COVID playing a big role in Rise's post-launch, but the handling of rewards was genuinely baffling, considering how World was supported. It seemed like near the end, the team responsible for making free Rise content was barely managing to port in World armors, and there just wasn't a big enough budget. Maybe the pandemic did have an impact. Remember my theories from earlier. The reason I was more inclined towards the whole Rise was never supposed to get updates guess is that technically, this is all just a worse version of what free World games would get. Maybe the plan was for Rise to just have a full Ultima-esque post-launch, and that would be that. However, there is another major reason as to why Rise's post-launch support was scorned upon. It's quite common for games to offer additional purchases, known as microtransactions. You pay a small amount, and usually get a bit of extra content in return. This is quite common among live service games, which are designed to offer continuous support for many years after release. They add lots of free content over time, and are sustained by lots of smaller purchases, by thousands or sometimes millions of players. Fortnite is a huge example, a free-to-play game entirely sustained by purchases of V-Bucks, an in-game currency that people can spend on cosmetics. The money is then reinvested into quarterly Battle Royale seasons and game modes that can be freely experienced, as well as hundreds of more cosmetics to buy. Helldivers 2 is a game I've been really into, where you play as a dispensable soldier and try your best to collectively win a galactic war alongside thousands of other disposable soldiers. The game has an upfront cost of half the price of a normal AAA game, and from there is sustained by battle passes that people can spend money on. The developers continually add new enemies, mission types, mechanics and planets in response. People question the ethics of microtransactions in priced games like, you already have my money, why do you need more? And examples like this are how it can be justified. Buying the game covers the initial development, buying DLC or microtransactions can cover continued post-launch development, although it's not always as straightforward or honest as that. Put it this way, people are comfortable paying for this stuff when they feel like they're getting something back. I buy the Helldivers War Bonds and continue to play the game as the Galactic War progresses. Monster Hunter games have always had live service elements, even from the very beginning. The first game locked Fatalis behind an online server connection. They've all added content after release in the form of event quests. World just took it to the next level by adding whole monsters, which organically had not happened before. World also took things to the next level by adding microtransactions. They never charged people for actual monsters like Lunastra or anything, but little pendants that could be hung onto your weapons, as well as cosmetics for the hunter's personal room. Rugs, tables, chandeliers, music from older games as well as remixes. They also sold gestures and poses, hairstyles and makeup. Pretty much none of it plays a role when it actually comes to hunting the monsters. Is it good that they're charging for this stuff? I mean, it's pretty harmless, and there's that whole continued post-launch development aspect. The older Monster Hunter games did not charge microtransactions. That might be because they were on weak handhelds, but it's also worth considering that they never really got updates. Do you remember how Rise handled events, where they would update the game monthly, and then that month's event quests would be unlocked on a weekly basis? That's how the older games would handle the post-launch support in their entirety. Every single full Ultimate update was already on the cartridge, and keep in mind that this game made it impossible to fight certain monsters at launch. You had to wait for Capcom to arbitrarily release the event quest that granted access to guys like Silverathalos or Dalamadeur. World, on the other hand, blatantly was not developed like that. Pretty much everything they added after launch was being worked on by a team of people after the game was already out. So many event quest armors, weapons, palico costumes, but also monsters, many of which had animated cutscenes, new music, Kolv Taroth, Leshen, Behemoth. And remember, all of this was free, and Iceborne took it all further. The very non-intrusive microtransactions felt like a small price to pay. Of course, the budgets of these updates were already factored in when developing that content. It's not as if the microtransactions single-handedly funded Alatreon, for instance, but people were fine with it because they felt like they were continually getting something out of the game. Rise took the microtransactions further. On the very same day the game released, you could enter the eShop and find DLC Pack 1, which cost $17.99 and featured a bundle of layered armor for the hunter, palico, palamute, gestures, makeup options, Kahoot outfits, as well as Hinoa and Master Itsushi's voices. The selling of layered armor as a microtransaction was an escalation when you consider that World refrained from doing that, and Rise continued to do it throughout its lifespan. It sold more and more of this paid DLC, eventually costing even more than the price of the game itself if you wanted to get it all. This angered people for quite a few reasons, but the biggest, like the Rampages, can be summed up in a simple sentence. Rise was selling way more in-your-face paid DLC than World did, while offering much less free content. Remember when I discussed microtransactions earlier? Generally, people are okay with them existing, or even buying them, as long as respectively they don't feel like they're really missing out, but also when they believe they're getting a lot out of the game. World and Iceborne had microtransactions, and the developers added Behemoth, Raging Brachydios, Alatreon and Fatalis. But Rise had two updates that were very obviously base game content sliced off, and then nothing but okay event quests and sometimes good and sometimes bad free rewards. Yet they were selling full layered armor sets despite so many quests not even offering that as a reward, instead opting for stickers or guild card titles. And World actually offered a large amount of layered armor for free, and layered weapons, which Rise only did once. It made Rise feel so much more scummier in that regard, especially because both games launched at the same price. One game objectively offered more post-release. This is the second reason why people just did not like Rise's post-launch support. There was a huge element of bitterness whenever a new boring event quest came out with no reward, while there were over £100 of paid layered armor on the eShop. If you only looked at the free rewards, it felt like Rise had a skeleton crew working on it, while the main staff had moved over to Sunbreak, but looking at the paid content proved that no, they mostly just wanted more money. Some people defend it by saying, well, it's just cosmetics. That's not really a real defense. I mentioned this earlier, but Fortnite only offers cosmetics. This means that when you enter a battle royale, everybody is on a level playing field, and only skill will let you win. This runs contrary to pay-to-win games that let you spend real money to get a huge advantage. People my age will remember Battlefront 2 letting you either spend 80 hours grinding for Darth Vader or paying a small fee to unlock him instantly, which was intentionally designed so that people would spend that money rather than grind, and so they would easily get an advantage over everyone else. There was significant backlash to this, and now competitive games generally only offer cosmetics as a result. The recent Marvel Rivals, for instance, has every character available for free. They instead make their money from cosmetics. So by saying, well, it's all just cosmetics, is essentially saying, well, it could be a lot worse, you know. Here's another thing with DLC that needs to be remembered. It's assumed that when you pay for a game, you're paying for all the labour that went into it up until release, and when you pay for DLC, it's with the understanding that labour was performed after release. Rise's DLC Pack 1 was released at launch as a separate purchase at roughly 35% of the base game's price. And remember, Rise was not finished. At best, it was shipped too early. Why couldn't this stuff be base game content? Because of greed. Obviously corporations only live to make money, but World was not this bad about it. Rise was releasing a huge pack of cosmetics every month for like 20 quid each, it was crazy. Some people argue that these microtransactions support the developers, and to that I say, no, not really. The developers largely got paid for their work already, and maybe they'll get bonuses if the game sells well at release, but they don't get royalties and the microtransaction money usually goes somewhere else. Judging by Capcom's other games, even the single player ones, it's obvious that there's some kind of corporate mandates to have microtransactions. Why? Because people do buy them. They're so easy for developers to implement, and they make so much money. The purchases are small, but they do add up over time, especially when thousands of people are buying them. The Resident Evil remakes and DMC5 offer up items that you could normally earn in-game. This is pretty much the definition of pay to win, spending money for an in-game advantage. But what's weird is that, according to people who've played those games, the items are always really easy to find for free, which makes the microtransactions a weird choice. Dragon's Dogma 2 actually got major backlash for this, because it too offered up items that were apparently easy to find in-game. The other games didn't really get backlash for this, but for Dragon's Dogma it was different, as the optics were a lot worse. Capcom were charging full next-gen price for this game, $70, £60 or £70 sometimes, and yet they still had the audacity to try and charge extra for items? And this was a single-player RPG, not a live service. If it's not greed, then why is your game paid to win? One of these items was to enable fast travel in an area. Again, easy to find in-game, but when Capcom are offering it up for money, and there's interviews of the game's director saying, oh, we have limited fast travel because we want you to travel the world, it makes one wonder, is that really true, or did you just want us to get frustrated and give you more money? Does Rise have bad event quest rewards because of COVID, or were they all busy trying to sell us more stuff in a series that historically was great with free content? Part of the Dragon's Dogma 2 outrage happened because the game was kind of appealing to the same type of audience that loved games like Elden Ring, which had no microtransactions and didn't charge people $70. It made Dragon's Dogma 2 look very greedy. I think the worst case of greed in World, Rise, Stories 2 and Wilds are character edit vouchers, where you have to pay money to change your character's attributes like skin colour or eyes or gender. I hate this. There's no justifiable reason other than greed to lock it behind a paywall. It takes no work on behalf of the developers for me to change my mind about an aspect of my character. I despise it. Elden Ring does not charge you to do this. Earlier I mentioned that you can buy character voices in Rise, and if that's the case, you can change your character's voice to that one, and then back to the voice you initially selected. But if you want to pick any of the base game voice options again, you need a voucher. Complete rubbish. Part of me wonders if Rise had more paid DLC than World, not just because World sold well and they wanted to double down, but because Rise has less opportunities to sell you stuff that's not layered armor. World, for instance, had the room and the weapon pendants, but Rise doesn't. That's something they can't really sell you, and if they have to meet a microtransaction mandate, then they need to look for other means. Funnily enough, Rise does have a room with decorations, and you unlock them by gathering all the relic records. That's kind of an amusing inverse of what World did, which was charge you money for them. Rise does have some good paid microtransactions, which feel more in the spirit of what this kind of DLC should be, namely the music. Rise offered up a lot of good remixes of the village and monster themes, and what's cool is that you can have them play in the village and related areas. World's DLC music tracks could only be played in the room, so this was a nice upgrade. And honestly, I'm cool with paying for this stuff because it ties back to the earlier dynamic I mentioned. When I buy the Storm Serpent Rock remixes, I know someone had to compose them, and that esteemed J-pop and rock singers Konomi Suzuki and Nano had to be hired to sing them. I'm happy to pay for that. There's also one other microtransaction thing that Rise does better than World, but I would probably chalk this down to a Switch offline limitation. When scrolling through gestures or pendants or room decorations in World, it blatantly displays the stuff you do not own mixed in with the stuff that you do, and selecting them will prompt you to buy from your platform's storefront. I don't like that. It's like the game is saying, shame you don't own this, it's right here, it could be yours. Rise doesn't do that at all, purely because I assume it would require an active internet connection, and the game is fully designed to be playable without one, but still. Despite Rise's flaws and the handling of the post-launch content, it was overall received very positively, and was a financial success. As of the making of this video, aka before Wild's released, it is Capcom's second best-selling game ever. But it was also quite divisive among Monster Hunter fans, and undeniably did not have the same legs or resonate with people in the same way World did. And so it's interesting to analyse Rise as the next game to World. That aspect coloured its perception in interesting ways because people ultimately compared the two a fair bit. World's insane success must also be factored into things, because it introduced a lot of people to the series who then went on to play Rise. World's story was very involved. It had your hunter explore the world alongside other characters, with animated cutscenes featuring your hunter interacting with the world and monsters, as well as many voice dialogue sequences. People debate whether or not the plot was great, but there's no denying that a lot of work went into it, more than any other Monster Hunter game. Rise's village story on the other hand was short, and about as complex as the older Ichinose games like Portable Third. Its high-rank story was largely told to us through unvoiced dialogue, which doesn't really immerse you as well. This naturally disappointed those who came from World expecting a similar story experience. World's quest structure was also different in a way that really helped pace the story better than Rise. It was basically non-stop urgent quests with the occasional stopgap. Meanwhile, Rise had the traditional quest structure, and even if it was more streamlined than in the past, the pacing still ends up being somewhat worse than World, not helped at all by the lack of new monsters in high rank, a problem World did not have. Rise launched with no killable Elder Dragons, with staples like Kushala and Teostra absent. The story ended on a cliffhanger, and there was no real endgame content. Not at all the case with World, which actually had those things: Elder Dragons, a completed story, and real endgame content. Having no killable Elder Dragons isn't a problem on its own, but Rise had nothing else to fill that difficult niche until title updates. Then there's the post-launch support. World getting tons of free content, both big and small, Rise getting what it did, but it goes further than that. World's events were on a rotation, where only a selection of them would be available at a given time, then they'd become unavailable, as another selection rotated in. Many people actually preferred this to Rise's approach, where events would release and remain there, because with World, it felt like there was more pressure to do those quests before they went away. It's a FOMO tactic, yes, but it worked, and it kept people playing over longer periods of time. And from a gameplay perspective, there were plenty of reasons why people drew comparisons between the two games that for many favoured World. World's combat was grounded, Rise's was reliant on wirebugs and silkbinds, which made things a little bit crazy. World had a huge focus on ecology and placing you in a living, breathing world. Rise did not. World had top-of-the-line graphics that still look good to this day. Rise is less detailed and scaled back. For very obvious reasons, mind you, but that doesn't change the facts. World had the tracking mechanics, Rise just shows you the monsters from the start. World had normal, grand orchestral music. Rise had very Japanese-inspired music with a lot of vocals, which may be an acquired taste for some. I mentioned Rise's combat zones being flat earlier, and how some people had criticised Worlds and for Ultimate's more varied terrain, but a lot of people do like them, for being more realistic and requiring some skill to fight around, and believed Rise's looked lifeless, and too much like boss arenas. There's some things that World did better than Rise, and other things it simply did differently. But outside of the games themselves, there were other reasons as to why some Monster Hunter fans may have been predisposed against Rise. After a whole generation and a half of Nintendo exclusivity, World launched multi-platform, released for PS4, Xbox One, and PC, and it brought in a lot of new fans. Many of those same fans would have loved to have played the next game in the series, but couldn't, seeing as Rise was once again a Nintendo exclusive. Not that many people can justify buying a whole console for one single game, and this led to some bitterness, and also hate towards Rise, almost from a console war standpoint. It's not too hard to find discourse from angry people around the time of the game's announcement. Even though Rise is available on all major platforms now, that perception was still there. Another aspect is that a surprising amount of people believe World would keep getting expansions after Iceborne, like an MMO. This type of person is rare, but I have seen them around and about, so when Rise was announced, it was a sign that the developers were done with World, and were moving on. So you had some people who were angry at Rise, seeing the game as a betrayal. I do think this group is in the minority, but I've seen them too many times to not mention. There was also a large group of Monster Hunter fans who didn't like World, and preferred the old games. They saw World as something different, and were hoping for a classic Monster Hunter game. Rise confirmed that it was never going to happen again. This game had no loading zones, it had World's combat. This was it, so a lot of those fans became angry at Rise too. So it's not at all difficult to see why some people, particularly World fans, were not too fond of Rise. Very different compared to what they were used to, and it does objectively do some things poorly. An example in miniature would be to compare Rise's Apex monsters with World's Arch-Tempered Dragons. Apexes are special Rampage bosses with very different movesets and appearances compared to their standard selves, being based on a deviance from generations. Beating them does not grant you with any armour, and only really one weapon tree, so you're really just fighting them for the fun of it. Meanwhile, Arch-Tempered Dragons have slightly different movesets, but they do offer armour. It's simply a reskin of what you can already get, but the skills are different, which gives people more sets building options. Arch-Tempered Dragons were added later in World's lifespan, and were pretty hard. The closest thing Rise got to them were the Emergency Apex event quests, which massively boosted their damage. They were some of the hardest challenges in Rise, and did make people appreciate them a lot more, but it was also just not as good as what World had. However, Rise does a lot of things better than World too, and as a direct follow-up, feels as if mistakes that game made had been learned from. Do you remember World's unified quest structure? It allows people to play the story together, but there's limitations. You cannot enter somebody's quest until they've seen the story cutscene. This leads to a really frustrating experience, where you're either sitting in the hub waiting for them to arrive at the scene, or having to start your own quest, see the cutscene for yourself, and then leave and join theirs. It's so obtuse. Rise simply plays the monster cutscenes from the start of the quest for everyone, and the story cutscenes for those who haven't yet completed the urgent quests, right at the end. All these cutscenes can be skipped, which isn't the case for World. The cost of this is that we lose out on those seamless cutscene transitions, and the monster introductions don't involve the hunter like they do in World, but the trade-off is very worth it. I've completed Rise and Sunbreak with numerous different friends, but I've given up on the few times I've tried in World. This is more of a preference thing, but World grants you decorations as random quest rewards. They're not craftable at all. I, for one, hate this. I never really got the decorations I needed, and the game doesn't really tell you which quests give you which decorations. Rise lets you craft them all with monster materials, which is the old-fashioned way. To me, this is far better, as it gives you actual targets to pursue, and you have far more control of your own sets. World's menus are rather fancy. They're quite different compared to normal Monster Hunters, and there's transition animations whenever you select something. This makes them feel unresponsive and sluggish sometimes, but Rise doesn't have this issue. The menu is very snappy, and perfect inputs let you go to your desired selection in seconds. Rise also streamlines the menus too. For example, World had the forging and upgrade as separate options, which got really annoying, but Rise combines them. Rise's monster notes are also far more detailed than World's, showing precise monster hit zones, elemental weaknesses and drop rates. However, this in particular is not something World did badly at all, because that game's hunter notes were a major improvement over the previous game too, so I'm not going to knock it for that. Then there's the weapon designs. World tried to have weapons that started off with really basic designs, essentially bone or iron with parts glued on, but as you upgraded them, they would eventually evolve into fully original designs. Unfortunately, it seems the staff was stretched too thin, and weren't able to finish most of the weapons. As such, most of them remain stuck as these ugly bone or iron designs, and this was even the case in Iceborne for some returning monsters. Rise leaves the World original monsters alone, but restores the weapon designs for the other returning monsters. In some cases, it even gives new designs for monsters. For example, Tigros got an insect glaive in Iceborne for the first time, but it was just a basic iron design. Same with Nargacuga and a charge blade, but Rise gave them both original designs. Tobi Kadachi never had a lance in World, but Rise gave him one, and funnily enough, this is an original design. While Rise has this undeniable advantage over World, it is lacking that game's alpha and beta armor system, which allowed for some really good customization. This is something people are contested on, but due to wyvern riding, Rise doesn't really have invading monster mechanics. In the older games, some monsters would interrupt your hunts and start attacking you. To counter this, you either had to fight them off or bring dung bombs to drive them away. World took this mechanic further when it allowed for 3 monsters on a locale at once. As we discussed earlier, Rise invaders help more than they hurt. Even Crimson Glow Valstrax, who has an invasion mechanic, will not actually damage you with the attack, only the monster. For those who found invaders to be an annoying disruption who were too easy to get rid of anyway, Rise handled them better. For those who saw them as a serious threat that really added an element of unpredictability to hunts, this was a con. It's down to preference. There's one more discussion that dominated Rise. To be honest, it's a major aspect of every game, world included, but it deserves mentioning here because maybe Rise warranted it. We did briefly talk about this earlier, but Rise was often criticised for being too easy. It was a fairly persistent criticism from start to finish, and I want to talk about it a bit more. I think that, based on everything we've discussed, it's not hard to see why people thought this. The village quests, the silk binds, and some monsters not really being built for them, the wirefall, the lack of a real endgame system, no invaders, etc. I also think there's a few things to consider. The new Monster Hunter is too easy is something people have been saying for more than a decade at this point, even for games like Try or 4, or even Freedom Unite. It's an old criticism, but also a true one. The games on some level have objectively been getting less difficult, by easing up on tough mechanics and introducing more lenient ones. World in particular overhauled so much and did away with a ton of older, more frustrating aspects that gave Monster Hunter a real rough edge, and Rise naturally retains much of those changes. And people liked those aspects and believed it really made you think about the decisions you were making, such as potion flexing. But then other things like walking into a loading zone and immediately getting jumped was more difficult, yes, but also extremely unfair. You have other cases like the older games limiting you to the items you bring on quests, as well as anything you've gathered. World and Rise give you the whole item box at a moment's notice. It's night and day in some aspects. From this standpoint, objectively Rise would be kind of easier, especially when you consider that Rise also cuts back on preparation severely. In the older games you had to bring hot or cool drinks to negate the Arctic or volcano temperatures, but Rise did away with them, among other things. This video is getting too long, but there is a genuine conversation to be had about how the older games would have you tailor a set and item loadout for a difficult monster, but then as you got better, you wouldn't have to try so hard and just fight them like any monster. But new games kind of just skip that part. But on the other hand, the punishment for forgetting the hot or cool drinks in the older games was more annoying than severe. You would just quit, go back to base, grab the item and depart again. A whole minute of your life gone, yes, but just a minute. Is it really a worthwhile mechanic? I also think that based on how Capcom has been handling endgame content in recent games, they've sort of designed the main story so that the majority of people can at least reach the final boss, with the content after that being for the real sickos like you and I. This is absolutely how Sunbreak handled things, for instance, and it does mean that the main story is maybe a bit easier than it used to be. Something people like to say to those who find the new games easy is, the games didn't get easy, you just got better. On one hand, we did just establish that the new games got easier, that's why I led with it. On the other hand, the argument does hold weight when you consider that a big chunk of Rise's player base came from World, particularly Iceborne, which was filled with some of the toughest endgame challenges ever. And it's like, yeah, people who mastered Fatalis would definitely find the Great Izuchi in Rise a bit easy. All the village content really. This happened with past games too. Monster Hunter skills are very transferable. There's another element I would like to discuss, which I refer to as second Monster Hunter game syndrome. Picture this. You've beaten a G or Master Rank Monster Hunter. You feel on top of the world. You have total freedom right now. You can fight anyone you want in the game anytime you want, with the best gear possible. You can make any set to try out any weapon, and you have too many items to count. Things are great. Then you move on to another, different Monster Hunter game, and right at the start you're weak. Your weapons suck. Your sharpness is awful and you're bouncing off everything. You don't have armor skills anymore, and you won't have any great sets for some time. Your food doesn't totally buff you yet, and you're stuck with the easier monsters for now. The game just feels weird too. You're so used to how the previous one felt that this new one is throwing you off, and you're not having a good time anymore. Rock bottom. I am describing not only what I think a lot of first time World players felt when they moved on to Rise, but what I felt when I went from 4 Ultimate to Generations on Switch. It sucked. It felt weird. The early monsters weren't exactly challenging me, but I wasn't really crushing them either. The Switch was the first home console I'd owned since the Wii as well. I was so used to the 3DS that it was a big adjustment, and felt so weird. And those who played Generations know how rough that game is at the start. I dropped the whole thing for ages, and I didn't properly come back until Stories and later Portable Third brought me back in. I bought a Switch for Generations Ultimate, and I still dropped the game. In regards to Rise in difficulty, I stand by what I said about the earlier monsters just being pushovers, but HR6 onwards being a decent challenge. Several of the monsters were able to make me struggle, like Magnamalo, the Apexes, Ghost Harag and more. And I do think the 3.0 update monsters are harder than everything that was in World's launch period. World's difficulty kind of exceeds Rise's when it comes to monsters like Behemoth or the Arch-Tempered, but how could it not, you know? But that game overall didn't challenge me much at all, and I do kind of side-eye people who act like there's a massive gap between it and Rise. There's other aspects about Rise that I would love to discuss, like the Spirit Birds, but I feel like a Sunbreak video is a far better time to discuss them, so we'll leave the difficulty stuff here. Rise is a very important game to me. Remember when Generations Ultimates made me quit Monster Hunter? I only really came back in a huge way during the pandemic, and I came back hard. I played Portable 3rd, beat GU, 3 Ultimates, 4 Ultimates again. I was hopping between Monster Hunter games casually. If I got bored of 4, I would play some 3, and if I got bored of that, I would go back to Generations. Rise was announced at this time, the next entry for my favourite series on my favourite console. In between Rise's announcement and release, I was able to play World and Iceborne. And while I was positive towards the base game, I didn't really like Iceborne for reasons long-time viewers should be aware of by now. The games I was really into during my big Monster Hunter binge of 2020 were all portable, on the 3DS, Switch, and even stories I beat on my phone. So when Rise released, being the ultimate portable game, yeah, I was all in. I loved the combat with the Silkbinds. Rise is the first game where I genuinely gave every single weapon a try, and became quite proficient with them because it was so much fun. The map traversal was great too, and I do think that as a base game, Rise has one of the best monster rosters. Good combat and good monsters ultimately make for a good Monster Hunter game in my eyes. Rise had some of the best changes World made too, changes to things that were kind of really annoying me in the older games. It also had none of the things that made me dislike Iceborne. I enjoyed World and Iceborne's story, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't get a bit tired of all the unskippable dialogue and cutscenes, especially on subsequent playthroughs. Rise lets you skip everything, and really, I don't come to Monster Hunter for big epic stories. If they're great then that's awesome, but otherwise I'm not really fussed. World's ecology was great, but it wasn't something I really engaged with, so Rise not having it was not a big deal to me. It was actually a positive considering Rise runs and loads so well. I also don't think Rise is an ugly game. There's some aspects of World I wish were in Rise, like weapon swaying as you run, but I do think by and large it's a good looking game. I really liked Rise's map designs, with the flat combat zones. It was nice to just focus on the fight and not worry about a random ledge tripping me up. The post-launch support was bad, and Sunbreak makes it look even worse. In fact, Sunbreak as a whole made Rise the worst in my eyes. But I really did enjoy my time with it, and I'm glad it exists. Rise is important to this channel, because it's the game I initially started making videos about. They're not particularly good, and I've been tempted many times to delist them, but it's how I started off, and kind of mildly blew up. This channel has changed a lot about how I approach Monster Hunter, gaming as a whole, being on the internet even, and Rise was responsible for it all. It's always going to be a very special game to me from that standpoint, and I overall have a lot of respect for how ambitious it was, and I do think that people will look back on it differently once Wild is out. In the future, I plan on making a video like this, but about Sunbreak. That will be pretty interesting because that expansion not only dramatically improved Rise, but also serves as something of a sequel to it. I think it will be really interesting to talk about in depth. Until then though, I will be enjoying Monster Hunter Wilds, along with so many of you. Thank you for watching this video. It's the toughest one I've ever made. Would you all think of Monster Hunter Rise as a whole? Not with Sunbreak, just Rise. Please let me know in the comments. Thank you for supporting me all these years. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a good day.